Hey guys, tonight we're going to drift across the vast moonlit emptiness of the Sahara Desert, not as tourists, but as soft-footed time travelers. Imagine the crunch of dry sand under worn sandals, the creak of leather water skins, and the flickering orange glow of campfires lost to the dunes. Beneath this yawning sea of sand lies more than just dust and silence. Whole cities sleep here, kingdoms buried and almost forgotten, as if the desert had secrets too valuable to share. You'll find yourself squinting against the sun that never blinks, trudging across dunes that look the same in every direction, with a single thought echoing in your head: I should not have come here without more water. And you're right. You probably won't survive this little excursion without at least one mirage-fueled hallucination or a scorpion-related misunderstanding. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking beneath a sky so wide it swallows thought. Nothing moves but the air itself, and even that feels exhausted. The desert, however, is not empty. Somewhere beneath your feet lies a chamber collapsed with age, full of pots, bones, scrolls, maybe a single sandal, whose strap still bears the imprint of a forgotten king's heel. The Sahara is not just sand. It's a layered archive, each dune, a chapter, each rock, a reluctant page. As you crest another ridge, the wind shifts. The sand whispers a hiss you could almost mistake for your name. That's the thing about deserts, they trick you into thinking you're alone. But long before our present silence, the Sahara roared with life. Entire networks of cities, trade routes, gardens, and cultures once sprawled across what is now seen as uninhabitable. These were not random oases with a few tents and camels. They were planned settlements with underground water systems, stone dwellings, and bustling marketplaces. And yet today, their names barely appear in textbooks. Ever heard of Takedda? Probably not. Nor of Ziz, nor of Tegdaoust. These are not the inventions of feverish archaeologists. They were mapped, mentioned in ancient manuscripts, and left traces so tangible you can still trip over their pottery shards. Historians still argue whether the Sahara's hidden kingdoms arose independently or were extensions of larger empires like Ghana or Mali. What's certain is that sand is an excellent archivist. Unlike jungle or floodplain, it doesn't rot things. It just gently smothers them, filing them away for someone curious enough to come digging. Even in modern times, entire fortresses have been found by accident by herders, smugglers, or heat-stroke scientists stumbling over old walls. Satellite imaging has even revealed ghostly street grids buried beneath dunes, a kind of desert X-ray exposing forgotten geometry. But what makes these lost places feel even more dreamlike is how little we know about their people. We've got hints, of course, skeletons, with jewelry still on scripts no one can read, and oral tales passed down by tribes like the Tuareg that reference mighty cities swallowed by the earth. These stories aren't just bedtime fables. In many cases, they led researchers to real places. You stop to adjust your scarf. The wind has picked up again, and this time the sand grains sting. You find shelter behind a rock, probably once part of a column or a doorframe. There's something carved into it, worn nearly smooth. You reach out, brushing away dust, and find a symbol. A sun, a date palm. You can't tell, but someone etched it here for a reason. The sun is starting to sink now, casting long shadows across the ridges. The light flattens everything, What was once a hill might now be the collapsed roof of a palace. You wonder how many stories lie beneath each step you take. You wonder if your footprints will be there for the next 1,000 years. That's the other strange thing about the Sahara. It's always shifting, yet somehow eternal. A perfect paradox for burying a civilization. 1,000 years ago, deep in the heart of what we now call desolation, men built cool homes beneath the earth and lit lamps with desert oil. But who were they really? And how did they vanish so cleanly that even their names became whispers? You lean into the dry wind and take another slow step. The heat rises from the ground like a ghost exhaling. Out here, survival isn't just about water. It's about knowledge where to walk, what not to touch, and most of all, how to disappear when the desert decides you've stayed too long. Long before, the Romans fretted over sandstorms, or oases, there was a people called the Garamantes. You probably haven't heard of them. They don't get prestige documentaries or Netflix miniseries, but for centuries, they ruled a hidden empire in the middle of the Sahara, carving out a life where logic insists no one should have lived. Historians still argue whether the Garamantes were a single unified kingdom or a loose network of city-states, each guarded by stone walls and prickly pride. What's not debated is this: they were real, and they were brilliant. You crouch beside a slope where stones poke through the sand like the ribs of a long-dead beast. This was once a city gate, or maybe a watchtower. From here, a road now half digested by time led to Wells workshops and a palace lined with columns. Not marble, but good enough. It didn't have to impress emperors, just the desert, and maybe a few traders hoping for shelter. What made the Garamantes so impressive wasn't their gold or armies. It was their plumbing. That's right, plumbing. Beneath the sand, they built fogaras, underground canals that tapped into deep aquifers and carried water gently downhill to their settlements. The trick was gravity. No pumps. Just careful digging, year after year, shaft after shaft, linking one to the next, like a giant ant farm with irrigation. These tunnels kept the water cool and out of reach of the evaporating sun. You can still crawl through them in places if you're brave enough and very thin. As you imagine these subterranean lifelines, you can't help but feel a kind of sleepy awe. These weren't nomads throwing up tents. They were engineers, farmers, brewers, scribes, and artisans. They made wine-raised cattle, grew wheat and dates, and probably told jokes about foreigners who couldn't handle the heat. At their peak, they traded with Carthage and later with Rome. Garamantes' warriors were known for their chariots pulled by horses through sand, yes, chariots in the desert, which is either madness or genius, depending on your wheel technology. Some Roman accounts describe them as fierce raiders darting in and out of desert passes like ghosts. Others seem to suggest grudging admiration. After all, the Garamantes weren't conquered, not in the usual dramatic fashion. They faded, slowly, like a well running dry. You pass a low wall, then another half swallowed by a dune. The shapes begin to coalesce into something town-like, a plaza, a temple. It's hard to tell. The wind smoothed everything down, like a hand rubbing away ink from a parchment. The Garamantes left behind stone tombs, some of them still standing, others cracked and half open. Inside, bodies rest with simple grave goods, beads, tools, sometimes a weapon. A few of the tombs seem unusually tall and narrow, which has sparked endless debates among archaeologists. Were they burial markers, storage, or something symbolic? representing a door to another world, historians still debate how centralized their government was. Some think there was a king of the Garamantes ruling from the capital city of Garama. Others argue that Garama was more like a shared trading hub, and leadership rotated or stayed local. The truth, as usual, is probably somewhere in between. And then there's the question of language. We have inscriptions, yes, but we can't read most of them. The Garamantes used a script related to Berber Tifinagh, scratched onto stone, or painted on pottery. It's a tantalizing cipher, a voice calling from beneath the sand, but muffled. You stop and sit for a moment on a chunk of stone that was probably a foundation once. The air buzzes with heat, and your thoughts drift like sand grains. If these people were so advanced, why did they vanish? Theories abound. Climate change is a popular culprit, not the modern kind, but a slow desiccation that turned their aquifers salty and their crops fragile. Others blame trade disruptions, political infighting, or disease. Maybe the canals collapsed. Maybe the chariots broke. Maybe they just got tired of fighting the sand. But here's something odd. Some Garamantes settlements were still occupied during early Islamic times. That means they didn't disappear in one dramatic sandstorm, but trickled away their descendants, folding into new cultures, new cities, new maps. You brush a line of sweat from your brow and look up. The sun has shifted, casting a golden glow over everything. For a moment, the city seems to come alive again. You can almost hear the clang of hammers on bronze, the laughter of children chasing lizards, the muttered prayers of farmers checking their palm trees. Then the wind kicks up again, and the illusion vanishes. You stand brushing the sand from your clothes. It's time to move on. But the Garamantes stay with you not as ghosts exactly, but as echoes. Smart, stubborn people who cracked the desert's code and lived here longer than most modern nations have existed. And all of it buried. Not forgotten, but rarely spoken of. Next time someone tells you Africa has no history, ask them about the people who irrigated a desert, fought off Rome, and vanished into their own myths. The Sahara doesn't forget. It just waits. Somewhere beneath the dunes, a shattered bone lies next to a rusted bell, fragments from a caravan that never made it. But what were they carrying, and where were they going when the desert claimed them? You wake from a light doze, sand clinging to your clothes like memory. The horizon has changed again, impossibly subtly. A faint trail of bleached rocks and bones draws your attention, like a path scrawled in ancient chalk. You begin to follow your steps, crunching over what once might have been the most important highway in the ancient world. The Sahara wasn't always a barrier. For centuries, it was a bridge, a corridor of sand connecting empires. The Trans-Saharan trade routes were the arteries of West Africa pulsing with goods, gossip, and gold. Imagine it, a line of camels stretching to the horizon, each one swaying under bales of salt rolls of cloth pouches, of incense and bags heavy with gold dust. And people, of course. Traders, scholars, slaves. All moving from one horizon to the next, trusting in their guides, their beasts, and the mercy of the desert. The road you follow isn't marked on any GPS. It's old. So old, in fact, that parts of it can only be seen from the air, faint depressions left by thousands of hooves and human feet. This path, winding from the Niger River, north toward Tripoli, was once bustling. Now, it's hauntingly still. As you walk, the ghosts begin to join you. Not malevolent, just curious, whispering in forgotten languages, asking if you've brought water, and stories. You pause where the trail forks. One path leads toward the Hoggar Mountains, another into the flat salt pans of the Takedda Basin. Both were critical to trade. The salt from Takedda was worth its weight in gold, quite literally. Caravans would haul the stuff across the desert to sell in Mali, Ghana, and beyond. Historians still argue whether the infamous silent barter method was used consistently or only in regions where language barriers made standard trading impossible. Either way, the image it paints is irresistible. Two groups meeting in silence, placing goods and stepping back, each waiting for the other to add or accept, never speaking a word. You step over a rusted nail, half buried in the sand. Not modern, but not ancient either. Perhaps 18th century. A reminder that trade didn't end when empires fell. These paths were used well into the colonial period, some even into the early 20th century. Cars replaced camels. Radios replaced rumor. But in the older days, it was all about the rhythm. Camels travel about 40 kilometers a day. Their hooves make soft, repetitive music in the sand. Traders knew the routes by memory, navigating by stars and landmarks long since buried or renamed. You reach a low hill where an ancient caravanserai once stood. Little remains, just a line of stones, and the vague outline of a courtyard. This would have been a rest stop, a place to water the animals, trade gossip, and maybe eat something other than dates and dried goat. A few scattered bones near the corner suggest not everyone made it. You gently pick up a rib, sun-bleached brittle. Human hard to say. The desert makes everyone anonymous eventually. And yet we know some names. Al-Bakri, Ibn Battuta. These travelers wrote of crossing the Sahara, marveling at the resilience of its people and the complexity of its networks. The Sahara wasn't an empty stretch of wilderness. It was a stage, a theater of dust drama and daring deals. You sit and drink from your flask. The air is so dry it feels sharp in your throat. In the distance, a mirage shimmers, no doubt, just heat warping the air. But for a second, you could swear it's movement. A camel? A caravan? No. Just memory playing tricks again. Still, the facts remain. The Trans-Saharan trade routes connected sub-Saharan Africa to the Mediterranean world. Ivory gold cola nuts and enslaved people flowed north. Textiles, horses, and knowledge came south. The desert was cruel but profitable. And the caravans were massive. Some reports speak of thousands of camels in a single convoy. Imagine that an undulating snake of fur and cargo winding through the sand for weeks, even months. It required incredible organization, guides who knew the terrain, water caches, night watches, rituals to ward off spirits. And yes, accidents happened. People got lost. Wells dried up. Sandstorms buried entire caravans. Every once in a while, someone stumbles on a cluster of artifacts, belt buckles, broken bowls, a child's doll made from leather scraps trapped beneath a dune. Historians still debate whether the most famous gold routes passed more through Gao or through Timbuktu. Each city lays claim to being the center of the golden age of trade. Maybe they both were at different times. What's clear is this wealth, knowledge, and power flowed through this desert like an invisible tide. You walk further, reaching a ridge where an old lookout post might have once been. The view is incredible. Sand stretches to the ends of the earth, broken only by the black teeth of ancient volcanoes and the whispering wind that never stops. For a moment, you close your eyes and try to hear it all, the hum of conversation, the groan of wooden wheels, the jingle of harness bells. It's almost there. Then it's gone. You descend into a narrow wadi dry now, but once a riverbed. More bones here. Camel definitely. You spot a few rusted rings. Tether points, perhaps. One is still embedded in a flat stone. Someone once tied their livelihood here and trusted it would be safe until morning. And there's something poetic about that. Trusting the desert. Even when it kills you, you move on. The sun dips lower. Shadows stretch, then blend. You light a lantern, an old oil one you brought for the aesthetic, and maybe the ghosts appreciate the gesture. As night falls, the stars explode overhead. No light pollution here, just the kind of sky that makes you feel like a single grain in a very large sandbox. You lay back on your bedroll, listening to the breeze as it sifts through sand and memory alike. Tomorrow, you'll visit a city built on all this, on salt and sweat, and the promise of faraway riches. But tonight, you're camped on the bones of trade. The desert doesn't keep monuments. It leaves you questions. You've heard of Timbuktu. But what if the real marvels lie just beneath its shadow, older, quieter, and nearly erased? Before this desert icon became a legend, others rose and fell without fanfare. The stars above you slowly give way to a pale blue dawn. You stretch brush a light film of sand from your face and sip the last lukewarm drops from your flask. Ahead lies a name you do recognize, Timbuktu, the fabled city of gold, of scrolls and scholars. A name so mythic it's become shorthand for the middle of nowhere. But Timbuktu, for all its fame, isn't the beginning of this story. It's a late chapter. As your boots press into the warming sand, the first minarets begin to rise in the distance, their shapes blurred by heat. But we're not stopping there. Not yet. Because scattered beyond Timbuktu's orbit are older names buried in dust, wrapped in mystery places like Tondibi-Esuk and Tegdaoust. Each one was once someone's capital. Each one a thriving hub, long before desert maps even featured Mali or Songhai. And yes, Timbuktu was impressive. But even its scholars would have admitted it borrowed greatness from places before it. You pass an outcrop that breaks the monotony of the plain. Beneath it lies a ruin, low walls, stone blocks in neat rows, a collapsed dome. This is likely Esuk, once a vibrant town in the Adrar des Sifogas. The name means marketplace, and it served as a key node in early Saharan trade long before Mali rose to dominance. Esuk was known for its stone architecture, a rarity in a region where mud brick usually ruled. It may have been the capital of the early Tuareg kingdom of Takedda. We don't have many written records about it, but the Arabic geographer al-Bakri mentions its wealth and influence in the 11th century. And now, centuries later, it lies forgotten, visited mostly by archaeologists and a few curious goats. You crouch beside a stone slab carved with geometric patterns. Was it a tomb marker? A boundary stone? Maybe both. Historians still argue whether Tadameka's people were Tuareg Berber or a blend with sub-Saharan dynasties. The truth is elusive, like all things the desert decides to half-preserve. Farther west lies Tegdaoust, a site tied to the Ghana Empire, one of West Africa's earliest kingdoms. Ghana, despite its modern geographic confusion, wasn't in today's Ghana at all. Its core sat closer to southeastern Mauritania, and Tegdaoust may have been a commercial and administrative outpost. What makes Tegdaoust remarkable isn't its size, but what it tells us. Excavations have unearthed signs of long-distance trade, Roman glass beads, North African pottery, Islamic coins. It paints a picture of a cosmopolitan hub, a place where merchants from vastly different worlds might have shared dates, jokes, and probably fleas. You wander through an open area where once tents and houses bustled. You imagine the smells, smoked camel sweat, fermented milk, roasted millet. the chatter in many tongues, the occasional argument about salt prices, a city alive with contradiction and rhythm, and all of it gone. You reach a low ridge with a stunning view. Below lies the Niger floodplain, greening slightly in the distance. Here, Timbuktu finally takes center stage. You descend slowly, your feet kicking loose stones, perhaps the same stones that once paved the roads for the great caravans. Founded in the 12th century, Timbuktu flourished under the Mali Empire, especially during the 14th century reign of Mansa Musa, the gold-laden emperor who made the pilgrimage to Mecca so extravagantly that it supposedly crashed the value of gold in Egypt for years. But Timbuktu's true glory came later under the Songhai Empire in the 15th and 16th centuries. This wasn't just a trade city. It was a beacon of learning. The University of Sankore, one of three great madrasas in the city, held tens of thousands of manuscripts. Some were theological. Others covered astronomy, law, medicine, and poetry. All written in neat Arabic script, often on fragile paper or vellum stored in wooden chests, or buried in secret caches when invaders came. You pass one such house, mud brick discreet, unassuming. Inside, generations of families hid manuscripts beneath floorboards and behind false walls. During colonial times, and even in recent conflicts, these manuscripts were threatened again, but many survived. And what they reveal is astonishing. Timbuktu's scholars debated planetary motion optics and the ethics of slavery centuries before the Enlightenment. They wrote letters to kings, kept trade records, and maintained detailed astronomical tables. Historians still debate whether Timbuktu's rise was more due to gold or knowledge. Likely both. Gold bought influence, but books built legacy. You walk past a quiet courtyard where you imagine scholars once sat under shaded awnings debating hadiths while sipping tea laced with mint. The walls are thick sun-baked, still warm from the afternoon glare. And yet the silence feels dignified, not abandonment, but rest. As you continue, you can't help but wonder, why is it we never learn these names in school? We hear about Rome, Athens, and even Babylon, but not Tegdaoust or Tondibi. These cities were real. They had plumbing politics, trade agreements, and court scandals, just like everywhere else. They simply didn't write their history in a language colonial powers cared to read. You pause at a plaque recently placed honoring a local librarian who smuggled ancient texts out during a recent siege. It's a quiet act of defiance and love. Farther ahead lies the edge of town, where a modern road cuts through centuries of soil. Cars now bring bottled water and mobile phones. But if you dig just a little metaphorically or literally, you'll find shards of a golden past. The sun dips low. A call to prayer floats over the rooftops. You stand still listening. Somewhere beneath your feet, the city's older layers slumber. In another 100 years, they may resurface again. But tonight, Timbuktu and its forgotten sisters live in your thoughts. You set up camp outside the city wall, where the stars return in full force. A desert breeze whispers against the canvas of your tent. You lie back, the past spinning around you like fine sand. Tomorrow, you'll walk toward the desert again, toward another place so strange it once made Roman generals turn back. But for now, you drift off surrounded by scholars' shadows and the soft rustle of ancient paper. You round a dune, expecting silence, and instead find a wall. Not one, but many. Crumbling, ancient, yet unmistakably man-made. Who built stone fortresses in a place where no one was supposed to live? Morning comes with the quiet crunch of wind-blown grit against your tent. You unzip the flap, and step into the early chill, stretching beneath a sky still soft with stars. You're far from the rivers and cities now deeper into the belly of the Sahara. No roads, no signposts, just the occasional bleached rock and maybe a story. And then you see it. A low rise in the distance rising against the pale sand like a broken tooth. You walk toward it, half expecting it to vanish with the heat mirage. But it doesn't. The closer you get, the more impossible it seems. It's a wall. Dry-laid stones, stacked with deliberate hands, angled slightly inward for stability, covered in sand yet still standing. You walk the perimeter boots, sinking into powdery dunes. The wall turns, then another joins it, a corner and another. You're standing inside the bones of a lost city. This is Djado. Most maps won't even label it. Even fewer travelers reach it. Tucked in northeastern Niger in the heart of the Djado Plateau, it's a ghost town, abandoned, sun-scoured, but still proud. The ruins of Djado are unlike most other Saharan sites. They're not entirely ancient. Most structures are medieval dating, from around the 12th to 15th centuries. But even so, they feel older. Maybe it's the silence, or the eerie preservation, or just the way they loom unexpected. You walk between walls tall enough to make you feel small. Many are crumbling, but some remain intact, complete with windows, doorways, and courtyards. The architecture hints at Sahelian influences: flat roofs, mud over stone construction, narrow passages designed to trap wind and cool the interiors. But there's something else, a feeling, as if the place is waiting, watching. Historians still argue who built Djado. The Kanem-Bornu Empire likely had some control here. Others suggest it was a Tuareg stronghold, or even a Berber trading enclave guarding salt routes. Some even whisper it was a refuge for exiles people who didn't belong anywhere else. Whoever they were, they built for permanence. The citadel-like structures suggest they feared attack, or at least wanted to project strength. And the layout, dense, strategic, inward-facing, suggests a people who knew how to survive scrutiny. You climb a flight of stone steps that leads to nowhere. A former rooftop, perhaps. From here, the entire settlement stretches before you, a labyrinth of rooms and halls. No roofs remain, only the skeletons. You try to imagine the city alive. Children laughing in alleys. Women grinding millet in courtyards. Traders arriving with goods. Elders passing stories under the stars. Now, all you hear is wind. Scattered throughout the site are traces of that life. Pottery shards. Rusted knives. The frame of a wooden ladder collapsed, but recognizable. A stone basin still half buried, once used to store water or grain. There are no signs, no plaques, no visitor center. Djado doesn't cater to memory. It survives it. But even survival has limits. You descend into what might have been a main square. A well lies at the center, dry-lined with ancient masonry. Some claim the city was abandoned due to water contamination, others because of raids. The truth, as always, is hazy. Likely it was both. That's the desert's way. It gives, then takes quietly. You find shelter from the rising sun in a shaded corner of a half-standing building. The stone here is warm golden and fine-grained. Not local. Transported, traded. For why would a desert outpost import stone? Historians still puzzle over Djado's materials. There's evidence that some buildings used stones not found nearby, implying organized labor and long-distance planning. Perhaps a sign of religious importance. A fortress. Or was it simply pride? Local legends speak of the city being cursed, haunted, visited at night by whispering figures with silver eyes. Those may be stories made to explain the silence, but they stick in your head anyway. You step through a narrow doorway and into what may have been a family home. The space is compact functional. You picture mats rolled out on the floor, dried meat hanging from rafters. A hearth in the center now cold and choked with sand. One odd detail catches your eye, carving small etched figures on the inner walls, stylized camels, spears, crescent moons, abstract patterns. These weren't decoration. They meant something. Maybe warding symbols, maybe warnings. You trace your finger across one. The groove is shallow, but sharp. Whoever carved it took time. Back outside, the heat is rising. You decide to climb a nearby outcrop for a wider view. It takes effort. The sand slips beneath your boots, and the sun is now a white weight above you. At the top, the plateau stretches endlessly. Dotted across the landscape are more ruins barely visible unless you know where to look. Djado wasn't a one-off. It was part of a network, other settlements, outposts, way stations built on the edges of endurance. And here's the thing. New ruins are still being found. Occasionally, travelers stumble on a wall, a staircase, a scattering of pottery. Each one raises more questions than answers. Why so many settlements in a place with so little water? Some theories point to the ancient climate. Thousands of years ago, the Sahara was greener a savanna in parts with lakes and rivers. Maybe these cities are relics from the tail end of that era. Others suggest these were not cities at all, but seasonal forts, used only in times of trade or war. You descend again as shadows lengthen. The walls of Djado seem to shimmer in the heat, like half-forgotten dreams. One last structure catches your eye, a tall, narrow tower at the edge of the complex. Part of it has collapsed, but the rest stands firm. A watchtower, maybe, or a minaret. You climb its base, where steps are carved into the stone. From here, the desert stretches into forever. The wind picks up again. You hear it whistle through the walls like a breath caught in a throat. Djado isn't dead, just sleeping. And maybe it dreams of the ones who'll remember it. Before banks, before coins, before calculators, there were gold flakes measured by sight in slabs of salt, hauled across oceans of sand. But how did something so heavy become as valuable as something that glitters? You leave Djado behind as the morning breeze begins to stir. With your pack slightly lighter and your thoughts significantly heavier, you press westward, following the faint memory of caravan trails. They're invisible now, erased by wind and time, but somehow you still know you're walking the same routes once etched by 1,000 hooves and human hands. This part of the journey is quieter. The terrain changes subtly. Smoother dunes, flatter plains, more salt crusts underfoot. It smells different too. Drier somehow. Crisper. You're heading into the domain of the two substances that once ruled the world, gold and salt. Today, gold is kept in vaults and salt in shakers. But centuries ago, both were carried across this desert with equal reverence, risk, and ritual. They were wealth incarnate, and controlling them meant you controlled destiny. Kings bowed to it. Empires were built from it. And people, so many people, lived and died to move it from one dune to another. You pause at a flat, sun-bleached platform of rock. A camp once stood here. Traders would have rested under makeshift tents, boiling tea, feeding camels, maybe whispering the day's prices like secrets. Salt was carved from pans, like the ones in Takedda, and Bilma giant flat expanses of mineral crust chiseled into meter-long blocks, then tied onto camels with thick ropes and burlap padding. Each slab could weigh up to 40 kilograms. Caravans might carry hundreds of them. and people wanted them badly. Salt wasn't just for flavor. It preserved meat, treated wounds, balanced diets, and sometimes even served as currency. In hot climates, a diet without salt meant death by slow mineral loss. That made it precious, sometimes more so than gold itself. In the Empire of Mali, salt slabs were stacked like coins. In Timbuktu's markets, they were traded for spices, cloth, even horses. In some seasons, you could exchange a single slab for a slave or a camel. You squint at the horizon. It ripples in the heat. Somewhere out there, an old caravan was swallowed, whole camels, cargo traders. Some say you can still find their bones if the wind has a generous day. Historians still argue whether Mali taxed salt more heavily than gold. Mansa Musa, the Golden King himself, understood its power. When he set off on his legendary pilgrimage to Mecca, his caravan included over 80 camels loaded with gold. But his empire's true lifeblood, salt. You crest a rise and find another campsite. A low circle of stones marks where tents were once pitched. In the center, a pile of blackened rocks, an ancient fire pit. The ashes are long gone, but the formation remains. Someone made tea here. Maybe argued about the price of ivory. Maybe dreamed of reaching Cairo or returning home to Gao. You sit and take a sip of your own tea, cooled now. From a tin thermos, not a camel-skin bag. You can't help but think the traders who passed through here centuries ago would recognize the quiet, the rhythm, even the ache in your knees. But they might not recognize the value shift. Today, salt is mined industrially. It's cheap, clean, and packaged in plastic. But the romance, the ritual of hauling it across burning dunes, remains preserved in memory, and in the rare modern salt caravans that still march from Takedda. These journeys can last weeks. The camels are led by nomads who memorize the terrain by starlight tradition and wind. They sleep in the open. They carry no GPS. And when they reach the trading posts, they unload the slabs with reverence. You brush a grain of salt from your lips, probably drifted from your dried rations. It stings slightly, just enough to remind you that this was once power. You continue walking, and soon the gold enters the story. Gold came from the South rivers, like the Senegal and Niger. From mines near Bambouk Bure, and later Akan. It was washed from silt, panned from stream beds, even mined with primitive shafts and tools. It came north in pouches, often as dust, sometimes as nuggets. Always guarded. The path from the gold fields to cities like Djado and Timbuktu was long and dangerous. Bandits, heat, and rival empires lurked at every turn, but the reward was irresistible. In European markets, African gold became coins, jewelry, church icons. It funded wars. It powered economies. Entire currencies like the florin and ducat were based in part on African bullion. And yet almost none of it stayed here. You reach a dry wadi, once a watercourse, now a memory. You climb down carefully. Halfway across, you spot something glinting in the sun. It's not gold, just a sliver of mica or quartz. But it reminds you how many others pass by such illusions chasing real wealth. You climb out and follow the edge of a stone ridge. Here you find petroglyphs, old carvings, camels, circles, maybe a map, maybe just art, or maybe a warning. Historians still debate how much gold actually moved across the Sahara. Some say tons. Others think the legends exaggerate. But satellite data now shows old mining sites where people once dug by hand, hour after hour, for dust that would change empires. The great irony, many of the miners were enslaved. Enslavement was part of this economy. Slaves were traded for salt gold cloth, and even more slaves. Some worked the mines, others served in cities. Some guided caravans bound by chains or debt. The wealth of ancient West Africa was built with genius, but also with cruelty. You reach a plateau as the sun begins its slow descent. The view is wide. The desert rolls like an ocean, soft and terrible. You set your bag down and rest. Somewhere below, you slabs of salt still lie, where camels dropped them. Somewhere else, specks of gold still cling to rocks no one will ever pan. You look west. The wind is rising. Another caravan is moving. Perhaps in legend, perhaps in fact. You close your eyes and listen. There are no jingling harnesses, no human voices, only the wind and the soft, ancient weight of wealth being carried by air. Tomorrow, you'll visit a place not known for what it held, but for what it wrote down. But for now, you dream of fortune in flakes and blocks. They weren't written to be read by the world. Yet here they are, hundreds of thousands of manuscripts hidden under floorboards and in desert caves. What secrets did the desert try to erase that scribes worked so hard to preserve? You wake to the sound of paper. Not pages turning, no one's here, but you. But something like it, a whispering flap, rhythmic and dry, like an old scroll breathing. Of course it's just your tent ruffling in the wind, but the thought stays with you as you pack up camp. The desert doesn't forget, it just misplaces. Your path takes you back to the river's reach, toward the quiet husks of once great cities. The kind where knowledge was stored not in vaults, but in trunks and mines. You're heading into the land of lost libraries. Timbuktu's name might dominate the headlines, but it wasn't the only center of desert learning. Far from it. Places like Chingedi Walata and Nema once hummed with scholarly debate, illuminated manuscripts, and the scratch of reed pens on parchment. You walk into the old quarter of a small Sahelian town. Mud brick walls, narrow alleys, wooden beams poking like ribs from rooftops. At first glance, there's nothing unusual. But then someone opens a door, and you glimpse the treasure within. Books, hundreds of them. Bound in leather, their pages yellow, with age edges curled like ancient smiles. This is a family library, one of many, passed down through generations, not part of an institution, not cataloged by any international database, but no less vital. The manuscripts are written in Arabic mostly, some in Ajami, African languages transcribed using Arabic script. They cover theology, law, astronomy, medicine, agriculture, grammar, poetry, and business contracts. Some are personal letters. Others are treatises copied by hand from older sources. You sit beside one carefully opened on a woven mat. The calligraphy is tight practiced. Margins contain notes from different centuries, each scribe leaving a whisper of themselves in the margins. Historians still argue how many of these manuscripts exist. Estimates range from $300,000 to nearly $1 million, scattered across Mali, Mauritania, and Niger. Many remain hidden not because of greed, but protection. Colonial officials once dismissed these texts as decorative fluff, ignoring their content entirely. But locals knew their value. During wars and invasions, families buried their libraries in clay pots, hid them behind false walls, smuggled them out, wrapped in rags. Some manuscripts have mold damage. Others are brittle from heat. But many are perfectly legible, surviving centuries in the dry, paper-loving climate. You're handed a volume bound in goatskin. It's light but sturdy. The title translates roughly to The Art of Measuring the Stars. Inside are diagrams, compass-like instruments, planetary alignments, notes on lunar phases. The scholar who wrote it lived in the 14th century. and his understanding of astronomy rivals what was being studied in Europe at the time. You pause staring at one equation. It's elegant, unfamiliar. You don't need to understand it to feel its gravity. But there's more. A short poem scribbled in the back. It reads like a lullaby about trade winds, a mnemonic device for travelers, or just a scholar amusing himself between charts. You smile. The human touches make the library feel alive. You ask your guide, an elderly man with eyes like ancient glass, how long his family has kept these texts. Since before France came, he says simply. He doesn't need to say more. You pass through other homes, each one humbler than the last, and each one guarding a handful of manuscripts. Some are stored in wooden chests, others wrapped in cloth, some balanced on shelves between tea kettles and laundry. These are not museum pieces. They're part of daily life. Historians still debate the influence of these texts on broader Islamic and global scholarship. Some believe they represent localized knowledge synthesized from trade oral traditions and imported texts. Others argue they show a parallel intellectual movement, one that thrived in the margins of formal empire. Either way, they offer something else evidence of intellectual dignity. The idea that a poor desert merchant might study jurisprudence at night, or that a traveling scholar might carry star maps along with salt contracts. You visit a local imam who invites you into a shaded courtyard. He recites from memory a passage on ethics written by a 16th century jurist in Nema. The words are sharp, thoughtful, and still painfully relevant. Afterward, he offers you mint tea and quietly says, "We do not need new ideas. We need to remember ours." You leave that house in silence, the weight of memory heavier than your pack. Later, as dust settles, you climb onto a rooftop and look out over the town. The sun spills gold across the earthen walls. Somewhere below, a teenager might be copying a manuscript by candlelight, just like his great-great-grandfather once did. And still, so much is left unread. You remember hearing of a group of volunteers who formed human chains to smuggle books out of Timbuktu during a jihadist occupation, risking their lives not for weapons, not for treasure, but for words, for knowledge. It was one of the great library rescues of the modern era, though it rarely makes international news. And here's the thing. These manuscripts challenge every stereotype of pre-colonial Africa, as oral only, as primitive, as passive. They prove otherwise. Not in theory, but ink. You descend from the roof as night comes fast and sharp. You sleep inside a cool stone room, a stack of books nearby. They seem to hum in your dreams, not speaking, just being. Tomorrow, you'll leave this quiet sanctuary. You'll walk toward palm-fringed pools that offer more than water, they offer doorways. But for now, surrounded by secrets, written in long loops of ink, you rest. They look like simple palm groves, shimmering mirages where tired feet find water. But some oases hold secrets from 10 different centuries, stacked on top of each other. What happens when time doesn't pass in a straight line but pools? You leave behind the libraries, the ink and the quiet devotion of scribes, and step once more into the breathless space between towns. The wind seems more curious today, nosing your scarf, stirring sand in lazy swirls. The heat is familiar now, though no more forgiving. But ahead lies something softer, greener, a promise breaking the horizon, an oasis. You quicken your pace as fronds sharpen into focus, as the shimmer resolves into something real, shade water and stories. Oases aren't just natural phenomena out here. They're stitched into human survival, like thread into cloth. Without them, No city could exist. No trade could thrive. No knowledge could travel. And yet most maps show them as dots, points of pause, not destinations. That's a mistake. You reach the edge of the grove. Date palms sway gently overhead. Beneath them, a cluster of low, mud brick homes crouch together, their walls cool to the touch. A small pool gleams in the middle, fed by a shallow spring. Children play in the dust. Women tend small vegetable patches with surprising energy given the sun. This is not a ruin. It's very much alive. But its foundations, older than memory. You're in the kind of oasis where time collapses, where each layer of soil hides a different story. A Roman coin found under a Berber pot, a stone inscription beneath an Islamic prayer niche, a bone comb next to a plastic bottle cap. Historians still debate how long humans have used these particular spots. Some suggest continuous habitation for 2,000 years or more. The layers don't just lie side by side, they blend. Each generation building atop the last, sometimes knowingly, sometimes not. You're invited into a family home. The interior is simple woven mats, low stools, walls smoothed by generations of hands. Your host pours tea. You sip slowly, the bitter warmth grounding you as he begins to speak. His story doesn't start with his birth, but with a flood that reshaped the valley. Before that, there was a battle. Before that, a caravan came through and never left. Before that, the spring moved 2 meters to the east. And before that, it was just silence. You nod. This is how time works here. Not in centuries, but in seasons, in floods, in long waits for travelers who sometimes never return. The spring bubbles gently nearby its waters, clear and surprisingly cold. This oasis, your host explains, feeds a dozen nearby settlements. It's part of a connaught system, an underground network of irrigation tunnels and access shafts designed to funnel groundwater with almost no loss to evaporation. You remember similar systems mentioned back in Garamantes territory. Different names, same ingenuity. A solution built on observation geometry and stubbornness. You walk out to the garden. It's not lush in the way you might expect, but it's alive. Rows of onions, chickpeas, a few citrus trees protected by palm shade. The soil is coarse reddish-brown. Everything here is done by hand. Someone brings a faded notebook. Inside, diagrams of planting rotations, rainfall notes, and a family ledger going back 4 generations. All of it handwritten. You spot the date of a famine, a locust swarm, a rare snow. This place is not just surviving, it's remembering. You follow a narrow path behind the garden and find the older part of the settlement. Stone foundations peek through the sand. A few cracked walls. Shards of pottery half swallowed by grass. This was the first village, your host explains, long before wells were deep enough or gardens grew strong. He gestures to a corner where they found bones last year, child-size curled like a question mark. No one knows the name. Just that the bones were treated carefully and reburied under a flowering shrub. Historians still argue whether oases were first settled for their water or for their strategic position. After all, if you control the water, you control movement. But maybe it was simpler. Maybe people just stopped walking the day they felt shade and said, "Here." You rest beneath a palm. The air is cooler here. The sounds gentler bees, the plink of a clay jar being filled, distant voices echoing off walls made of earth. And it hits you. This is the most stable place you've seen in days. Not a fortress, not a ruin, just a community that never stopped. A soft persistence. You're shown a flat rock under a canopy blackened with soot. This was the message stone once. Travelers etched symbols or burned messages into it to signal who had passed through. Most of the marks are gone now, but one small glyph, a spiral, maybe a family sign, is still visible if the light hits just right. At night, the oasis hums. Not loudly, but with presence. Frogs in the pool, the occasional bleat of a goat, a drum beat faint and infrequent, like a heartbeat echoing in the distance. You lie on your mat and think of how many people slept here before you. Some in fear, some in love, some just tired. The palms wave above like watchful guardians. And there's something comforting in the repetition. The idea that no matter what changes, people will keep planting fetching water, telling stories. Tomorrow, you'll head toward ancient graves, more bones, yes, but also clues to lives once lived where sand now dominates. But for now, under leaves that knew empires, you sleep. No pyramids, no gold masks, just skeletons curled in the sand surrounded by fishing tools. What were people doing in the Sahara? When it had lakes, you leave the oasis as quietly as you arrived. A soft nod, a grateful smile, and the familiar tug of pack straps on your shoulders. The desert welcomes you back with a dry kiss and a breeze carrying fine dust. You head northeast this time toward a place older than any empire, older even than agriculture. It's not a city or a temple or a ruin. It's a lake shore, except the lake is long gone and the shore now lies buried beneath meters of sand. You're going to Gobero. It doesn't sound like a legendary site, and for a long time it wasn't. In fact, it wasn't discovered until 2000 by accident during a geological survey in Niger's Tenere Desert. But what it revealed shook assumptions about what was possible in this seemingly lifeless part of the world. Because Gobero wasn't a trade hub or a fort. It was a cemetery. But not just any cemetery. A burial site containing hundreds of bodies, some over 9,000 years old. People who lived, fished, hunted, and buried their dead in the middle of what is now one of the most inhospitable regions on Earth. You crest a slope of loose gravel and sand. The air feels ancient here. There are no ruins to greet you. Just a subtle dip in the terrain, and a silence so deep you can almost hear the past exhale. Archaeologists found two main cultural layers at Gobero. The older from around 7700-6200 BCE, and the newer from 5200-2500 BCE. Both groups lived during what's known as the African humid period, when the Sahara was not a desert, but a green savanna dotted with lakes and rivers. Yes, you heard that right. Historians still debate why the Sahara transformed. Some blame changes in Earth's orbit, others suggest shifts in monsoon patterns. But for thousands of years, this wasn't sand. It was grassland. You step carefully across the sand, imagining it as it was. Reed beds, swaying in the breeze, shallow pools teeming with catfish, and tall grass, rustling with gazelles. And people. Always people. One of the most striking finds at Gobero was a burial of a woman and two children. Their skeletons were arranged with care hands, touching faces turned toward each other. The woman had jewelry made from hippo tusk. The children were surrounded by grave goods, a gesture of deep, enduring love. And then the lake dried. There was a gap of about 1,000 years when the site was abandoned. Then another group moved in. Taller, leaner, with different tools. They fished, hunted, and lived here until the region dried out again, this time for good. You find a fragment of stone flint, maybe. Once part of a knife or a scraper. You place it back down. The site today is protected, monitored, but you can still feel its story in the ground. Bones are buried here, not just human ones, but crocodile, hippo, elephant. Can you imagine a hippo in the Sahara? And yet that's what the layers say. These people weren't eking out a desperate existence. They thrived, built boats, carved tools, shaped ceramics, painted their bodies. Some were buried with turtle shells, some with antelope horns. This was culture, not survival. You take shelter under a jagged ridge, the only shade for miles. The rocks here are ancient, blackened by time. Petroglyphs cover some of the surfaces. Stylized giraffes, spirals, human figures dancing. Not just marks, but meaning. Historians still argue whether these peoples were ancestors of modern ethnic groups. There's no clear genetic line, but culturally, they were part of humanity's wide, sprawling experiment in civilization. What makes Gobero even more extraordinary is its vulnerability. Unlike stone cities or fortified towns, everything here depends on dust and wind. Bones crumble, shells break. One careless step can erase a story. You read once that the archaeologists slept in tents barely 100 meters from open burials, carefully mapped and covered each night. Some of the skeletons had hair preserved, even skin traces. Time, when dry enough, can be strangely kind. You walk a little farther and come to a shallow depression, the ancient lakeshore itself. You kneel. No water, just silence. And yet your mind floods with images of family pulling in fishing nets, someone gutting a catch with a polished bone knife, laughter echoing over the reeds. There's something sacred about the normalcy of it. We often picture ancient people building temples, fighting wars. But here, they just lived and died and honored their dead. You spot a low marker stone recently placed by conservationists, a reminder that memory matters. As the sun dips lower, the shadows stretch across the site like fingers trying to hold on. You set your pack down and sit in the fading light. What happened to them all? Climate changed, of course. The rains retreated. The lakes shrank. The grass died. And people moved, southeast-west, chasing water, carrying with them not just tools, but stories. Stories that maybe seeded kingdoms, built songs, wove into languages we still speak. Or maybe they vanished like the lake. You lie back and stare up at the sky. It looks the same as it must have thousands of years ago. Stars waiting to be named, winds waiting to shift, futures waiting to be planted. Tomorrow you'll follow whispers etched into masks, faces we can see but not name. But tonight, among the bones of a lakeside people, you sleep where water once sang. They stare without blinking bronze faces with empty eyes. Some are smooth, others snarling, found nowhere near where they were made. Who lost these masks, and why are they so hard to place? The morning comes sharp and fast. The desert has no patience for dawdlers. You rise with sand in your ears and the vague ache of sleeping near unmarked graves. After brushing off your clothes and shaking the last dreams from your pack, you continue east into terrain, less defined, less documented, and far more peculiar. Today's journey leads to objects, not ruins, expressions without voices, relics that historians file under unclear provenance, which is a polite way of saying, we have no idea what's going on. You crest a ridge and begin descending toward a region known more to collectors than cartographers. This is where scattered pieces of history have been uncovered but not connected. Here, wind has unearthed bronze masks, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Most small, some full-sized, all with haunting eyes. Some are beautiful, others grotesque faces frozen in exaggerated expressions of fear, authority, or trance. Their features are neither strictly North African nor sub-Saharan. Their design doesn't fully match any known culture, and yet they were clearly made with intent, technique, and meaning. You pass a flat stretch of sand dotted with rocks. A shepherd found the first mask here in the 1980s, nestled in the dunes. Since then, more have emerged, often uncovered by shifting wind, not excavation. They've been found near Djado, near Bilma, and as far afield as central Niger, always alone, never buried with bodies, no temples, no inscriptions. Historians still argue about their origin. Some say they are relics of a lost desert culture, a metallurgical society that created art for rituals we can no longer decode. Others believe they were trade items made elsewhere and scattered by time conflict or migration. The masks are usually cast in bronze, though a few are made from copper or lead alloys. The craftsmanship varies. Some are smooth and symmetrical, others rough and hurried. Some have loops for hanging, others pegs that suggest they were affixed to something. But what a wall, a head, a god. You sit on a warm stone examining a photo of one such mask, high cheekbones, almond eyes, and a stylized mustache curling like a riddle. No writing, just a face locked in permanent performance. Nearby, a shallow depression marks the spot where another was found, half buried, gazing up at nothing. No tools nearby, no bones, just the mask. You look around. No workshops, no signs of habitation. So who made them? One theory holds that these masks were part of a funerary tradition placed on skulls meant to guide spirits or intimidate enemies. Another suggests they were worn by priests or mediums during trance rituals, possibly enhanced by smoke dance or sound. Yet another posits they were currency tokens of alliance allegiance or tribute. And here's where it gets stranger. A few of these masks have been found hundreds of miles apart, but with near identical features. Were they copied, mass-produced? Or did one mask maker wander the desert like a prophet with a portable forge? Historians still puzzle over the metallurgy. The bronze doesn't match any one regional recipe. Some alloys are surprisingly advanced, implying access to multiple trade routes or knowledge handed down in secret. You trace a circle in the sand with your boot. The idea forms slowly, like a mirage. Maybe these masks weren't from one place at all. Maybe they were the language of many peoples, an adopted symbol like the cross or the crescent shifting meaning as it moved. You walk farther and come across a pile of stones, deliberate stacked. In the center, a hollow. Possibly an old shrine, or perhaps just a resting place. No mask here, but the absence hums. Imagine carrying one of these across the desert, tied in cloth, wrapped in story, given to a ruler, or buried with a curse. Later, you meet a local guide who claims his grandfather unearthed one long ago. He didn't keep it, the guide says. He said it watched him while he slept. The family reburied it the next day. There are stories like that, folk tales, rumors, masks that brought drought, or madness, or luck. People say they hum at night. Others claim their expressions change over time. You don't believe most of it. But even so, when you're offered the chance to see one up close, an authentic one privately held, you hesitate. Eventually, curiosity wins. In a dim room beneath hanging cloth and a bulb, the color of tea, the mask sits on a woven mat. It's heavier than it looks. Cold. The eyes are wide hollow, rimmed with faint carvings that might be writing or just decoration. You stare at it for a long time. It doesn't blink. Of course it doesn't. Still something shifts. The mask is not trying to tell you something. It's daring you to ask better questions. You leave the house with your thoughts louder than your steps. Tomorrow, you'll follow those who remember not through bronze or books, but by word, by song, by firelight. But tonight, your dreams are full of faces you can't name. No ruins, no scrolls, no skeletons. Just stories told by fires, sung by mothers, painted in sand. If the map forgets a city, but the people remember it, does it still exist? You wake to voices not near, but carried across the desert by wind. Not language exactly, just the rise and fall of a chant, fading as quickly as it arrived. It's morning again, and the desert, ever patient, waits for you to move. Today, you don't seek artifacts or ruins. You're chasing something more fragile memory. The Tuareg called themselves the Kel Tamashek, the people who speak Tamashek. They are nomads, camel herders, traders, poets, and storytellers. You've heard of them probably. Their indigo-dyed turbans, their resistance to colonial rule, their fierce independence. But what you may not know is that they've kept something no museum can hold cities in their minds. You walk toward a camp of low tents arranged like petals around a fire pit. The people greet you with nods, cautious smiles. Hospitality here is automatic, but trust you must earn. Over time, as you share tea and stories of where you've been, they begin to open up. And what they tell you is remarkable. There was a city, they say, out near the rock formations past the salt flats. It had high walls, a well that sang, a market where strangers came from the sea. No one remembers when it was built. No one knows exactly when it disappeared. But their grandmothers spoke of it, and their grandmothers before them. You ask for its name. They shrug. Names change, they explain, but stories don't. Later, an elder draws in the sand with a stick lines, curves 3 dots. This was the symbol of the city, he says. We use it still, on our bags, our knives. It means, here we rest. You realize he's describing a place archaeologists haven't yet confirmed. No ruins, no satellite blip, just oral memory passed across centuries like a flame. Historians still argue how much of the Tuareg oral tradition aligns with physical evidence, but that's missing the point. These stories aren't meant to be proven. They are proof in themselves that people cared enough to remember. You spend the day listening. One tale describes a king whose city sank into the ground after he banned poetry. Another tells of a queen who married the wind and vanished into the dunes. Some stories are wild. Others feel oddly specific street layouts, color of walls, number of market stalls. You start to sense a pattern. These aren't just folk tales. They're mnemonic maps. Ways to keep history alive when paper isn't practical and ruins turn to dust. You ask an elder why they don't write these stories down. We do, he says. In rhythm, in verse, in ink made of air. At night, the stories become songs. Women gather around a small fire humming soft refrains while grinding millet. Men chant lines while adjusting saddles. Children mimic the rhythms without knowing the words. And in each verse, fragments of the past, a caravan lost, a river changed course, a warrior who never returned. Pieces of forgotten kingdoms, still flickering like distant stars. You hear about a place called Amasakul, the meeting place, said to lie where 3 caravan routes crossed. No ruins there now, but the Tuareg know the trail, know where the stones feel unnatural, where the sand sinks a little deeper, where the wind doesn't sound right. Historians still dismiss some of these tales, but they've led to real discoveries. Buried walls, shards of pottery petroglyphs hidden in ravines. Memory, it turns out, is a compass. Imperfect, but persistent. You speak with a young guide who's memorizing over 200 songs, each one linked to a location, a time of year, a family line. His grandfather taught him. His sister writes them in script on leather. But most still live in sound. You ask what happens if no one sings them anymore. They wait, he says, and you believe him. There's a rhythm to these stories, call and response repetition with variation. You hear about a white lizard that guarded a hidden spring, a stone that cried once a year, a city made entirely of tents, pitched in perfect rows, invisible by day, glowing at night. You ask again, where are these places? They were, someone says. They might be again. That night, you sit beneath a sky, blistered with stars. The fire has gone low. Someone hums a slow tune, almost a lullaby. You recognize it now. It's about a city. One with no name, no coordinates, and no surviving walls. Only stories. But somehow, it still lives. Tomorrow, you'll walk into an ancient lake bed and find proof the Sahara wasn't always sand. But tonight, the wind carries words that no ruin ever could. A whale spine in the desert. A crocodile fossil next to ancient fish traps. Could the Sahara really have once been blue? You're walking uphill across what feels like the surface of the moon. The ground is cracked dry and pale as old teeth. There's no shade, no sound, no signs of recent life. But something's wrong with the rock. It's smooth in places, rippled in others, almost like it's been underwater. Welcome to the heart of what was once Lake Megachad. Not a poetic name, but an accurate one. At its height, this ancient lake covered more area than all of modern France. Imagine that water stretching from northern Nigeria to southern Libya. A blue jewel in the center of the continent, now replaced by sand memory and dust. You descend into what was once a shallow bay. The stones here are layered silt clay fossil bone. Everything's quiet now, but the past screams if you listen. Scientists estimate Lake Megachad reached its maximum size around 7,000 years ago during the African humid period. The same stretch of green time that birthed Gobero and made oases out of mountaintops. Rainfall was steady. Rivers flowed. The Sahara wasn't a wall, it was a sponge. And humans adapted accordingly. You spot a cluster of stone tools near a dried-out creek bed. These weren't dropped yesterday. They're thousands of years old scrapers, hand axes, fishing weights. Yes, fishing. In the Sahara. That's the image that refuses to fade. You find shell fragments next, crushed underfoot by some long-gone hippo or water bird. These aren't out of place. They're just leftovers from the time when this was a shoreline. Farther along, something even stranger, a fossilized fish trap. Just a row of rocks now, but unmistakably arranged. The angles are too neat. The pattern too specific. Someone laid these to catch tilapia catfish or barb's common species when water ruled. You pause and drink. The irony hits hard. Historians still debate how long Lake Megachad lasted at full size. Some say just a few centuries. Others argue for several thousand years, with periods of shrinking and expansion, like the breath of the earth itself. Eventually, the rains withdrew. The lake shrank, then split into smaller bodies. Lake Chad, Lake Fitri, Lake Bodele. What remains today is a fraction of the former glory. Just a sliver clogged with reeds, its edges debated even by modern maps. But the bones tell the truth. You climb a gentle ridge. At the top, fossils. Fish, vertebrae, shell middens. Even if you're lucky, a crocodile skull, its teeth still sharp, its sockets hollow. This was once their domain. And near them human remains. Not buried ceremonially, just there. as if someone died while hauling a net or cleaning a catch. People who lived by water depended on it shaped their tools around its habits. You sit on a flat stone and pull out your journal. Try to sketch the contours of a lake you'll never see. It's not easy. The mind resists imagining lakes and deserts, just as it resists imagining cities under dunes. But you've seen enough now to understand the Sahara isn't timeless. It's moody. It remembers green just as easily as gold. Nearby, a cluster of rocks casts strange shadows. You walk over and realize they're not random. They've been placed. A ring, a marker, perhaps a grave, or a shrine. It's impossible to know, but the fact that it exists says someone was here. Someone cared. You find pottery next, small fragments patterned with lines. The kind used to store grain or water. The kind found in river communities. And this is the hardest part. The people who lived here didn't vanish. They moved, followed the shrinking water south or east, took their language tools, songs, and seeds with them. Traces of their culture survive in groups today through dialects, farming techniques, and oral tales that start with "back when the land was blue." Historians still question how much of the Green Sahara population helped spark the rise of Nile Valley civilizations or West African kingdoms. The overlaps are tempting, but the evidence, as always, is patchy. Stories outlast skeletons, and even bones forget. The sun tilts lower. Shadows stretch across the fossil beds. The air is bone dry but cooler now. You take one last look across the ancient lake bed and imagine wind skimming water, the slap of paddles, the cry of birds. Then it's gone. Tomorrow you'll see how newer invaders, those armed with notebooks, maps, and flags, tried to rewrite these stories for themselves. But for now, you drift off to the ghost splash of ancient waves. They came to dig, to name, to measure, but whose past were they really uncovering? And how much did they quietly bury instead? You wake not to birdsong or breeze, but to the clatter of something metallic. Somewhere nearby, an old fence rattles in the wind, a relic not of ancient kingdoms, but of colonial surveys. It's a jarring reminder. Not all who came to the desert were explorers in search of wonder. Some came to catalog, others to conquer, and some to erase. Today, you're walking in footsteps less celebrated. The boots of 19th and 20th century European archaeologists, geographers, and gentlemen adventurers. Men with leather-bound notebooks, monoculars, and a disturbing fondness for renaming things that already had names. You pass a battered sign half swallowed by sand, marking the remnants of a colonial-era expedition base. Nothing remains but metal scrap broken crates and a tin coffee cup warped by sun and time. Yet this spot, this nowhere, was once central to how Europe tried to make sense of Africa, or rather, how it made Africa make sense to Europe. Historians still argue whether early archaeological missions in the Sahara were more about science or spectacle. Some genuinely sought knowledge, others sought trophies. Most brought with them unshakable ideas about civilization that filtered every bone pot and inscription through a deeply colonial lens. You walk toward a known dig site, one excavated in the 1920s by a French team. Their records published in French journals speak of primitive peoples, exotic cults, and pre-Islamic decay. But what they found, layers of pottery burial mounds, architectural remains, tells a more complex story. You crouch beside a partially exposed wall. Its stones are tight-fitted, elegant in their precision. The original report described this as a barbarian granary, but newer analysis suggests It may have been a religious center or even a school. The early archaeologists made detailed sketches, took photographs, and then took artifacts, masks, scrolls, tools, even bones shipped back to Paris or London or Berlin, where many still sit in museum basements, labeled vaguely as Saharan artifact date uncertain. You climb a ridge and look down into a shallow excavation pit. Someone's tried to continue the dig. In recent years, there are fresh tags, a tarp staked to the ground. But what you're seeing isn't just a site, it's a palimpsest, a layer of modern intrusion atop ancient life. Colonial digs often excluded local voices. Guides were treated as laborers. Oral histories were ignored. If a local elder said a ruin had once been a school, the archaeologist might write superstitious belief in phantom buildings. Even the names were overwritten. Indigenous sites were renamed after colonial figures, or given Latin codes: Site Delta 5 Mound, Vincent Sector Marceau. You walk farther toward a small hill where another mission once worked. You find the corner of a crumbling concrete foundation, likely a supply station. Here, the teams kept their tools, their rations, and their assumptions. What's often forgotten is how much damage these missions caused. Some digs used dynamite to loosen strata. Others plowed through burial sites with carts. Skeletons were removed, labeled with guesswork, and never returned. Even today, some European institutions resist repatriation efforts. You find a notebook left behind by a more recent visitor. Inside are sketches not of bones or ruins, but of local elders. Quotes in Tamashek. Someone trying to do better. It gives you a sliver of hope. You remember a scholar who wrote, "To study a place without listening to its people is to study a photograph of a fire and say, you understand heat." Back at camp, your guide tells you a story. When he was a boy, he saw a team of Europeans take a carved stone from his village's well. They called it Roman. He called it his grandfather's marker. The archaeologists left. The well collapsed. The stone never came back. Historians still debate how to untangle colonial influence from Saharan archaeology. Funding methods, ethics, all are tangled in a legacy of extraction. And yet, thanks to local scholars, nomadic voices, and even satellite tech, that legacy is beginning to shift. More digs now involve community elders. Oral maps are consulted. Some artifacts are being returned. Slowly, the past is being rewritten by those it belongs to. You end the day beside an old metal stake, its paint long gone. It once marked a border, not just on land, but between who gets to remember and who is remembered. Tomorrow, you'll rise above the desert, with tools the colonials never had tools that see through sand. But tonight, beneath a sky uncaring of empires, you close your eyes and listen for stories buried deeper than any trench. No pickaxe, no shovel, just satellites. Eyes in the sky have found roads no one remembered, walls too straight to be natural, and cities that left no ruins. So how much has the desert really hidden? The wind has dropped overnight, leaving the morning uncannily still. Your tent barely stirs. Sand rests where it fell. Even your footsteps seem muffled as you walk out into the pale hush of a waking Sahara. You're no longer hunting ruins on foot. Today, you're seeing the desert the way birds and satellites do from above. Once, archaeologists worked inch-by-inch brush in hand map and lap. But now, a growing number of discoveries in the Sahara are made not by digging, but by watching. You squint at a printed satellite image in your notebook. It shows a stretch of desert not far from where you camped 2 nights ago. On the ground, it looks like nothing. Sand. Flat. featureless. But in infrared and high-resolution imaging, a faint grid emerges, parallel lines, right angles, patterns the human hand can't help but make. You're heading there now. It takes longer than you expect. Foot travel never quite matches digital maps. But eventually, you reach a broad plain of pale gravel and cracked earth. To the naked eye, it's unremarkable, maybe even boring. But you open your satellite image again and align it with what you see. And there it is, a ghost street, or at least what might have been a street. Stones lie in a faint linear pattern. Every few meters, a bump or alignment. Your GPS shows nothing. The road isn't on any map, and yet someone laid it down. Historians still argue when the use of satellite imagery truly revolutionized desert archaeology. Some credit the 1990s. Others point to just the last 2 decades. But what's clear is this: the Sahara viewed from space is full of things no one noticed from ground level. You move to another site. This one is stranger. A perfect square, faint but consistent, shows up in the satellite image. When you arrive, there are no walls, just shallow depressions. But then your boot strikes something hard. Stone. Cut not natural. You dig a little gently. A corner reveals itself. Sand spills away. It's a foundation likely. You mark the GPS. Another square, added to a growing list. Researchers have found entire settlements this way, clusters of rectangles where once people lived, traded, and slept. Some are 2,000 years old. Others might predate even the earliest known Saharan cultures. Then there are the line's long winding tracks, possibly caravan roads. Some stretch for hundreds of kilometers. No modern road follows them. But camel bones found at regular intervals suggest they were well used. Some follow natural water routes. Others defy logic, heading straight through dunes to oases no longer visible. You climb a low hill to get better perspective. Pull out a drone and launch it. The hum breaks the silence. As it climbs, the landscape flattens into pattern, the same way a quilt reveals its design only when seen from above. The drone returns data. You compare it with maps made in the 1800s. They missed half of what you see. You find more a circular structure, possibly a granary or defensive post. Lines of darker soil suggesting ditches or irrigation channels long since buried. In one area, a strange grid too regular for natural formation. Could it have been a market? Historians still debate how to interpret satellite imagery without digging. Some fear it leads to assumptions. Others see it as a revolution, a way to protect sites without disturbing them, to map a past too fragile for pickaxes. And this is key. Satellite archaeology helps avoid the mistakes of the colonial era. No dynamite, no looting, just watching, documenting, letting the desert speak. You return to camp with new coordinates and an exhausted memory card. Your guide looks at your screen and nods. Old people said there was a town there, he says. But no one believed them. Now you do. Tomorrow, you'll end your journey walking not through a ruin or a memory, but into the wind itself, where stories still ride the dunes. But tonight, under a canopy of starlight and data, you sleep with maps not yet drawn. You can't find them on maps. Their cities are gone. But their names, soft, strange, beautiful, still ride the wind. If no stone remains, but a name survives, is that not proof enough? The desert greets you one last time with its oldest trick, silence. Not absence, but presence disguised. You pack slowly this morning, not because you're tired, but because the weight of leaving feels different. This isn't just the end of a journey, it's the end of an echo. You've walked among bones, ruins, road ghosts, and scrolls. But today isn't about artifacts, it's about air. You head toward a stretch of dune known locally as the listening place. No signs mark the way. No coordinates lead here. But everyone you've met in the last week has spoken of it. The Tuareg singers, the oasis keeper, even the elder who remembered a city with a well that sang. You crest the ridge at mid-morning. The wind is constant now, not angry, just insistent. And you realize something odd. It doesn't whistle. It murmurs. The locals believe names ride this wind, those of forgotten cities vanished, kings wandering, scholars, children buried in salt. They say, if you sit long enough, the wind will whisper a name meant only for you. So you sit and listen. At first, just wind. Grainy, restless shifting patterns. But then you begin to notice textures. A rising note here, a fall there, almost like breathing. Then a sound, a name. It comes and goes. Maybe it's in your head, maybe not. It's soft, with too many vowels to pin down. But it feels like someone. Historians still argue whether oral cultures preserve memory better than stone. Some claim cities forgotten in writing live on in voice for centuries longer. Others say names without ruins fade too fast. But the Sahara complicates all of that. Because here, you've learned that absence isn't always loss. Sometimes it's protection. Many of the kingdoms you walked through weren't built to last forever in stone. They were built to last in sand, in wind, in the memory of travelers who carried them in story, not on parchment. You remember the woman at the oasis who recited an entire family tree stretching back 600 years. Or the masked elder who drew a vanished city's streets from memory naming every vendor stall. Or the boy who sang a song that mapped a trade route no satellite has ever confirmed, but your feet swore was real. All of them preserving what monuments could not. You lie back now, the sand warm beneath you, the sun high, the wind soft. Around you, nothing visible moves. But everything you've seen whispers below the surface. The Garamantes canals still trace the rock, even if the water is gone. The salt roads of Takedda still imprint camel paths, even if the trade has shifted. The golden cities before Timbuktu, the lost libraries, the masked faces, they linger not as ghosts, but as reminders, a memory of resilience. You reach for your notebook, and it's full. Every page scratched with notes, maps, questions, half-remembered quotes. But none of it feels finished. The desert never is. You think back to the first ruin you stumbled into. How empty it seemed. How alive it feels now. You'd passed over the surface, then beneath it, then above it again. And each time the truth shifted. Historians still puzzle over what makes a civilization lost. Is it the absence of records, the lack of ruins, the failure to dominate its neighbors? But walking here, day after day, the answer becomes simpler. A civilization is lost when we stop listening. You take a final breath of the thin, dry air, the kind that strips voices down to truth. You stand brushing sand from your clothes and take one last look at the horizon. It rolls forever folded, layered wise. No tombs, no flags, just wind and light and memory. As you walk back down the ridge, the wind rises again. And if you're honest with yourself, you do hear something. A name. Maybe yours, maybe theirs. But this time, you don't question it. You let it follow you home. You're standing at the edge of a vast desert, not a blank emptiness, but a living, breathing museum of riddles. Crumbling stone arches poke out from dunes like fossilized waves. Circular pits spiral into the ground with no clear purpose. Buildings, or what's left of them, tilt in defiance of time, their bricks somehow still clinging together. like ancient promises. The camel you didn't know you'd need today snorts with irritation. Somewhere behind you, your water skin makes that ominous slosh, barely a gulp left. And yet, despite the modern discomforts, something magnetic pulls you forward. These ruins aren't just relics, they're puzzles with missing pieces. You notice how some walls curve inward, channeling air in odd ways. Others have vents placed with suspicious mathematical precision. It feels too clever for mere guesswork. You kneel beside a half-buried mosaic. It's not just decorative, there are symbols aligned like a calendar or a chart. Historians still argue whether this site was ceremonial residential or experimental. Maybe it was all three. What's certain is that something brilliant once thrived here, something with no modern blueprint. See, the desert has a sense of humor. It hides its secrets in plain sight. Take, for example, a cluster of buildings partially dug into the sand, their rooftops lined with strange vertical shafts. At first glance, they look like broken chimneys. But step inside, and you'll feel a rush of cool air where there should be none. No wires, no fans, just geometry and gravity. The desert's silence plays tricks on you. One moment, it's a vacuum of heat and nothingness. The next, it's an acoustic chamber. You clap, and the echo bounces unusually fast, as if the walls are sculpted not just for shelter, but for sound. Could they have used acoustics to communicate? Or was it simply clever design amplified by centuries of erosion? Let's not get ahead of ourselves yet. We'll get to the drums, the wind catchers, and the strange desert medicine soon. But right now, just take in the feeling you're standing where a civilization once looked at this vast wasteland and said, yes, this will do. Not only did they survive, they innovated. And while modern technology prides itself on sleek metals and silent motors, the ancients worked with sand, sun, and wind. That's the flavor of brilliance we're chasing tonight. Not the loud kind, the whispering kind. Before we talk about how to cool a room without electricity, picture this. You're in the middle of the desert, inside a stone house high noon. Outside, it's 45 degrees. Inside, a breeze cools your face. No fans, no vents, just holes in the roof. What sorcery is this? You squint up into the ceiling and spot the tower. It's narrow at the top, wide at the base. You feel a steady draft brushing your cheeks, even though the air outside is still. No whirring, no mechanical hum, just physics. Maybe even a little magic. Welcome to the world of wind catchers. The people who lived here centuries, sometimes millennia ago, didn't wait for Dakin or Dyson to be born. They sculpted wind like potters shaping clay. These wind catchers, or badgers as they were called in Persia, are vertical shafts built above homes. They're topped with openings that catch the breeze, any breeze, and direct it down into the living quarters. Not all winds are equal, of course, so the openings could be turned or shaped to filter the right current, letting the cool, dry air in while pushing the hot, stale air out. This wasn't trial and error. It was engineering. Imagine a hot air balloon in reverse. The hot air rises up and escapes through the top, while cool air is sucked in from below. That's the basic premise. But in the desert, it's not just about managing heat. It's about managing extremes. The desert doesn't forgive miscalculations. You build wrong, you sweat. You build smart, you survive. In some regions, they added internal channels that passed over underground water pools. That's right, they added evaporation, cooling to the mix. As the air passed over the water, it cooled further before entering the living spaces. Some scholars argue whether these features were intentional or happy accidents, But you don't align bricks with this much precision by accident. One of the oldest known examples comes from the city of Yazd in Iran, where the wind catchers rise like silent sentinels above earth-colored domes. Even today, some of them work. You can stand underneath and feel the air dancing past you, untouched by compressors or electric coils. And the beauty is they weren't just functional. Many were works of art, intricate carvings, geometric shapes, lime-plastered inner walls to reduce drag and heat absorption. If you're picturing crude chimney stacks, try again. These structures looked like something out of a fantasy novel, tall, elegant, purposeful. Meanwhile, in Egypt, people built inner courtyards and narrow alleyways that channeled the desert breeze like rivers of wind. Homes were arranged not just for aesthetics or privacy, but to maximize ventilation. Some buildings even had small domes with holes that acted like pressure regulators like nature's air vents. And here's a twist. Some of these techniques show up across ancient civilizations, Mesopotamia, Indus Valley parts of North Africa. Historians still argue whether they borrowed from each other or stumbled upon similar solutions independently. Either way, the results were astonishingly consistent. And don't assume these were luxury features for the elite. Entire neighborhoods were built with airflow in mind. Public baths, market halls, even underground cisterns, everything participated in this quiet ballet of thermodynamics. It was like the whole city was breathing. One curious site in the Arabian Peninsula even features what appear to be passive solar chimneys combined with wind towers. It's a Frankenstein of eco-design, and yet it worked. The combination allowed for cooling during the day and heat retention at night when the desert chill crept in. You probably wouldn't survive a week here in your modern studio apartment. Double-glazed windows, worthless, central air overwhelmed. But these people thousands of years ago built their comfort into the bones of their homes. And it wasn't just about cooling. Wind catchers also helped with ventilation. In dense urban quarters where waste and food smells built up quickly, fresh air was more than a luxury, it was hygiene. The architecture didn't just shelter you from sun and sand. It refreshed your lungs and flushed out the past. Let's not forget sound. These structures often produce subtle whistling or humming noises as the wind moved through them. Some believe this was accidental. Others think it was intentional, designed to keep the homes from feeling deathly silent in the still heat. The kind of ambient noise that would make a monk jealous. And remember those stone ruins from earlier. Some of those vertical shafts you saw previously misidentified as chimneys are now being re-examined. New research suggests they might be proto-wind catchers even in areas we never associated with such tech. Think prehistoric HVAC systems hiding in plain sight. But why did the knowledge disappear? Some blame colonization. Others point to the decline of localized building practices in favor of globalized concrete and steel. Either way, these genius systems were gradually labeled as primitive, discarded in favor of machines that hum and buzz and require a constant feed of electricity. And now architects are quietly copying the past. Green building designers are studying wind catchers, mimicking passive cooling in luxury resorts, even integrating them into skyscrapers. One university in the UAE installed a modern Badgir-inspired shaft in its central courtyard, and guess what? It dropped the ambient temperature by 7 degrees Celsius. You may be wondering if they did all this without electricity. What else did they do without it? We're just getting started. Next up, how to cross hundreds of kilometers of featureless sand without a compass. They didn't have satellites, or Google Maps, or even magnets to mess around with. And yet somehow they could traverse vast deserts and arrive exactly where they meant to. The real question is how you might expect the desert to be disorienting. And you'd be right. No street signs, no reliable landmarks. And when the wind picks up, even the familiar dunes shift overnight. But desert travelers, nomads, traders, even raiders still manage to move with eerie accuracy from one oasis to the next. They didn't stumble around hoping to get lucky. They navigated. You look out at a seemingly endless ocean of sand, and yet the wind tells you something. The stars confirm it. Even the dunes speak, if you know how to listen. Let's start with the basics. For many desert dwellers, the night sky was their compass. Constellations were more than just stories. They were maps. The North Star Polaris anchored them. In the southern hemisphere, the Southern Cross did the same. But it wasn't just about north-south direction. The position of stars at certain times of night told them not only which way they were facing, but how far along they were on their journey. In essence, they had a celestial clock. Sounds straightforward. Well, it gets weirder. The Bedouin, whose desert navigation skills remain legendary, also relied on wind. Not just any wind. They'd memorized the prevailing wind directions of specific regions. The sound it made, the temperature it carried, even the texture of sand it left behind. Some could tell what direction they were facing just by feeling the wind on their cheeks. And speaking of sand, ever heard of singing dunes? It's a real phenomenon. Under certain conditions, dunes emit a low hum, or boom, as grains cascade down slopes. The pitch and rhythm change depending on grain size and movement. Nomadic groups were known to use this eerie sound to track distance and orientation. No one's quite sure how widespread this was, but you can bet it wasn't just a spooky lullaby. Some believe the vibrations acted as long-range signals, early warnings, or meeting cues. Historians still argue whether this was an intentional tool or a happy byproduct of desert acoustics. But don't imagine lone wanderers staring at stars all night. Groups often used fixed horizon markers, particular hills, oddly shaped rocks, or even specific trees. Some of these markers were intentionally altered, painted, carved, or aligned with certain celestial events. You'd pass by a marker only visible at dusk from a certain direction and know you were halfway there. Of course, sandstorms made visual cues useless. That's where oral memory came in. Paths were remembered as songs. Verses passed down from elder to child, each line tied to a stretch of landscape, a rise here, a windbreak, there a hidden spring behind that crescent-shaped dune. The song lines of Australian Aboriginal desert cultures come to mind, poetic maps encoded in rhythm and lore. Some desert peoples did the same, although most records were sadly never written down. Even more surprising, they used temperature gradients. Seriously. Desert floors heat unevenly. People learned to feel the subtle difference between soft, warm sand and crusty, cold patches. Clues that hinted at nearby water vegetation or shade. At night, the warmth retained by certain stones helped orient those who walked barefoot. Painful? Probably. Effective? Definitely. There's also evidence that some desert travelers used trained animals, camels mostly, as living compasses. Certain breeds were known to home instinctively to familiar oases. You'd let the beast lead. You just had to trust it, even if it looked like it was walking straight into a sun-baked oblivion. In Western Sahara, Ancient Tuareg guides employed what they called azalai knowledge. This was part environmental awareness, part inherited map, part spiritual connection. One guide would take you across 1,000 kilometers of sand with no instruments and no maps, just memory. Some Tuareg clans were so trusted that rival tribes would hire them in wartime to navigate supply routes. And let's not forget sound. The way your voice echoes in the desert can reveal distance and emptiness. Travelers learned to call or clap in rhythm and listen to the returns. A short delay might mean a rocky hill ahead. No echo at all. Open dune field. Some routes were named not for what you saw, but for how they sounded. Even foot placement mattered. Seasoned travelers walked in zigzags, not just to avoid fatigue, but to follow the way the sand hardened along old caravan routes. Beneath loose grains, the packed trail remained a kind of fossil path, invisible to most, but not to those who'd walked it since childhood. Let's say it plainly, this wasn't guessing. This was a science, a delicate blend of astronomy, geometry, climatology, and human intuition. And we barely understand it. Modern attempts to reconstruct these techniques rarely succeed. When GPS fails, we don't lift our heads, we panic. The ancient desert traveler lifted theirs and smiled, because the sun's position, the sand's shape, and the breeze's behavior were all telling a story. So are we less advanced than they were? We'll come back to that. But before that, what if I told you their solar technology didn't just guide them? Sometimes it fed them. Have you ever tried to fry an egg on a rock? Now imagine doing that on purpose, with precision, every single day. But what if your frying pan was made of clay, your oven shaped like a flower, and the only fuel you ever needed came from 93 million miles away? That's right. Before there were solar panels or Elon Musk's roof tiles, ancient desert civilizations were already mastering the art of solar energy, not just in theory, but in every sweaty, practical genius way possible. You're sitting at the edge of a village. Clay domes rise around you like frozen bubbles. Some are homes, others ovens. One in particular catches your eye. It's shaped like a shallow dish and lined with what looks like polished stone. You squint. It glints. It's not metal, but it reflects the sun like one. You approach, and that's when you see it set carefully in the center, a cooking pot steaming. No firewood, no smoke, just heat harnessed from the desert sky. This is a solar cooker, and it's not some gimmick invented in the 1970s. Civilizations from the Indus Valley to North Africa used variations of reflective cookers to boil water, bake bread, and even heat medicinal oils. Some of these contraptions had sun tracking abilities, either passive using water to tilt panels or manual systems where users adjusted mirrors throughout the day. Pretty sophisticated for people supposedly living in primitive times. Historians still argue whether these devices were widespread or elite curiosities, but excavations in Sudan and parts of western China show signs of charred clay and burn patterns inconsistent with wood or dung fires, suggesting focused heat sources likely solar in origin. And solar tech didn't stop at cooking. Desert dwellers use sunlight for illumination. In certain homes, shafts were cut into ceilings at precise angles to let in light at specific times of day, almost like nature's spotlight. Morning sun would fill the kitchen. Afternoon beams would light a study corner. Some even used polished copper or obsidian panels to bounce sunlight deeper into darker rooms. One unearthed structure near Luxor had what we'd now call a solar light. Well, a narrow vertical channel capped with a semi-transparent mineral likely gypsum that diffused harsh desert light into a soft interior glow. You stand inside one of these structures and feel like you're in a naturally lit temple, not a dusty hut. Solar water heating, you bet. Terracotta pipes and cisterns left in the sun all day provided warm water for bathing crude, maybe, but effective. And unlike our modern water heaters, these didn't require fossil fuels or circuit boards, just clever positioning and patience. Now here's something you might not expect: desert refrigeration. Using sunlight. Let's break that paradox. Ancient Persians built yakchals, massive dome-shaped structures that stored ice through the summer. During winter, they'd harvest ice from nearby mountains and store it in these subterranean chambers. But to keep them cool, they'd often position the yakchal near sun-drenched walls, painted white, reflecting heat away, and use carefully angled air vents to keep cool air cycling. Some experiments suggest that by combining solar-shaded insulation with evaporative cooling, these ancient engineers extended ice storage by months. In the desert, even more mind-bending archaeologists in northern Africa have found evidence of solar desalination. Not modern plants with turbines and steam, but shallow clay basins covered in glass-like sheets. The sun evaporated brackish water, which then condensed on the underside of the covering and dripped into collection jars. Simple, silent, brilliant. And all of this without a single kilowatt hour. Meanwhile, today entire cities struggle to meet energy demands with solar panels, arguably just reinventing the elegant wheels of ancient ingenuity. Even clothing took advantage of solar principles. Desert garments weren't just about covering skin. They reflected light, captured minimal heat, and allowed airflow in very specific patterns. Some robes were dyed with minerals that deflected infrared rays. You walk past a market stall, and a vendor tells you his great-grandmother's cloak stays cooler in sun than in shade. You laugh until you touch it, and it's true. Of course, it wasn't all practical science. Solar worship played a role too. Temples aligned with solstices, icons placed where sunrise or sunset would spotlight them on sacred days. Were these purely religious, maybe? Or maybe it was another way of syncing daily life with the sky's rhythms. Either way, it shows how intimately people understood the movement of light. One curious site in present-day Morocco features sun-aligned stone rows, each marking a key solar day. Some believe it was a calendar. Others say it was a system to plan agricultural labor. Regardless, it's a reminder that sunlight was never taken for granted. It was calculated, observed, and optimized. And this is where modern arrogance gets a well-deserved sunburn. We think of solar energy as cutting edge. But these ancient cultures didn't need blue glass panels or inverters. They used shapes, angles, colors, and textures. Their materials were humble clay, stone, metal scraps. But the thinking behind them, sophisticated. Today, scientists in arid regions are studying old solar cookers to design new ones, lighter, more portable, but still based on the same basic logic. In Egypt, sustainable building projects are borrowing layout techniques from mud brick desert homes to reduce dependency on electric lighting. In Tunisia, you can still find artisans who remember how to polish ceramic bowls until they mirror the sun. You're not looking at the past. You're looking at blueprints for the future. And that future, just like the past, is bathed in golden, unforgiving, absolutely magical sunlight. Now what happens when that sunlight becomes your enemy? When wind and sand batter your home day after day. You'd better hope your walls know how to fight back. Imagine a house that gets stronger the more sand you throw at it. Now imagine that house standing for 800 years, untouched by time, wind, or storm. What if the real secret to survival in the desert was to build something that wanted to be buried? Welcome to the architectural paradox of the sands. You begin to notice something strange as you walk through these ancient ruins. The buildings that have survived longest are not the tallest nor the thickest walled. They're the ones that look odd, rounded instead of angular, sloped instead of straight, built not to resist the wind, but to flow with it. The logic is immediately visible. Sharp corners collect sand, curved ones deflect it. Flat roofs collapse under weight. Domes disperse the pressure. And the best material, mud. Not just any mud, but carefully mixed clay straw and sometimes camel dung, sun-dried into what we now call adobe. It's humble, yes, but it breathes, insulates, and flexes without crumbling. You step into an old desert mosque. The walls are over a meter thick, but cool to the touch like a cave. No air conditioning needed. That's not a poetic metaphor, that's ancient science. These walls absorb heat during the day and release it slowly at night. Temperature regulation without a thermostat. Some structures, like the Malian city of Djenné's Great Mosque, are so well engineered they require only minimal yearly maintenance, even while facing dust storms and downpours. But the design isn't just about heat and sand, it's about wind pressure. Tall walls are fluted with buttresses and tapered towers breaking up gales before they slam full force. Historians still argue whether the fluted facades are decorative, religious, or aerodynamic, maybe all three. And let's talk entrances. Desert homes didn't always face the street. Instead, they were turned sideways, or even inward, shielding doorways from prevailing wind currents. Some had L-shaped vestibules to trap incoming gusts before they reached the inner sanctum. Kind of like an ancient version of a windlock. You crouch near a narrow slit window, not for the view, but for ventilation. It's angled so precisely that it allows airflow while blocking direct sunlight. Above you, the ceiling might feature wooden slats or vents aligned to circulate warm air upward. Hot air rises, yes, but only if you give it somewhere to go. These design tricks weren't universal. The architecture varied wildly by region. Some desert cities were whitewashed to reflect sunlight. Others were painted ochre or earth tone to blend with the dunes and reduce glare. Some structures were partly subterranean, dug into the earth for insulation. You walk into one such half-buried home and feel like you've stepped into a cool cellar, no electricity, just clever use of soil as thermal mass. In the Arabian Peninsula, certain towns used coral limestone as a building material. It was light breathable and surprisingly strong. And yes, coral from the sea. Transported, traded, and shaped into shelters that defied both humidity and heat. Some homes were deliberately built to collapse. Wait, what? Yes, lightweight mud brick shacks were designed to fail safely in case of violent sandstorms. Rebuilding was fast and used locally available materials. Think of it like a reset button. Lower risk, lower cost, zero concrete. And this brings us to a kind of wisdom that modern builders have mostly forgotten: fragility as a form of resilience. In modern architecture, failure is disaster. In desert architecture, failure is planned. And that's just the structures. Let's look at the layout. Many ancient desert towns were designed like spirals or wind mazes. From above, they look like labyrinths. That wasn't just to confuse invaders, it slowed the wind. Long, narrow alleyways channeled breezes into manageable drafts, while shaded courtyards served as cool retreats. One of the most fascinating examples is the ancient city of Shibam in Yemen, nicknamed the Manhattan of the Desert. Its tower-like mud brick buildings rise 5 to 11 stories high. Built close together, they shade each other, creating cool air channels and reducing sun exposure. And they've stood for centuries. Not bad for mud. And yes, they had drainage systems. Gutters and spouts made of baked clay directed rare rainfall safely away from walls and into underground cisterns. No erosion, no floods, just thoughtful design. Even rooftops played a role. Some were curved or sloped to catch and direct rain. Others were used for drying herbs, sleeping under the stars, or even for storing food in clay jars buried halfway into the roof for insulation. Then there are the fences, not for privacy, but for sand control. Low perforated walls around homes reduce sand buildup by breaking wind speed. They didn't block the sand completely, they tamed it. You pass a broken shard of tile embedded in a crumbled courtyard. It's glazed light blue, possibly ceramic. Why? Because glazed tiles reflected sunlight and kept surfaces cool. In places like Samarkand, walls and floors weren't just pretty. They were practical thermoregulators. Even color choices mattered. White reflected, indigo cooled by optical illusion. Black used sparingly absorbed warmth for night use. And let's not overlook the craftsmanship. People built with what they had, earth straw stone, but they designed with long-term comfort in mind. Not for resale value, not for curb appeal, for survival, for peace, for shade. Today, modern architects are rediscovering these ideas. Passive cooling earth architecture, zero energy buildings, all buzzwords that trace their roots back to ancient mud brick wisdom. They're studying how a rounded wall diffuses wind pressure, how a dome disperses heat, how aligning a home to the sun's path can reduce a year's worth of energy bills. You don't need reinforced concrete when your wall wants to breathe. Next up, what if the very stones around you weren't just rocks, but a kind of unspoken code? Before we begin, next time you see a pile of rocks in the middle of nowhere, don't dismiss it. It might not be random. It might not be natural. What if the people of the desert wrote books not on parchment, but on stone? You're walking through a dried riverbed when you notice them oddly stacked stones. Not just a pile, but a formation. Some are tall and narrow, others flat and laid like dominoes. They don't point to anything obvious, but something about them feels intentional. You stop. You look closer. One stone has a carved groove so smooth and shallow, it almost disappears in the sunlight. Another has dots arranged in a neat triangle. You crouch down, brushing sand aside. More grooves. Not letters, not language as we know it. But this is communication. Welcome to the silent language of the desert stones. These weren't just markers or decorations. In many ancient desert cultures, stones were used as tools of memory, not because people lacked writing, but because paper didn't last. Parchment crumbles, clay breaks, but stone endures. In North Africa, especially among Saharan nomads, arrangements of stones known as tumuli or cairns marked not only burial sites, but directions, boundaries, and sacred spaces. These markers weren't randomly placed. They were carefully chosen and precisely aligned. Some pointed toward water sources. Others marked tribal zones. Still others may have encoded migration routes or seasonal patterns. Historians still argue whether some of these patterns functioned as mnemonic devices, like visual songs. The number of stones, their shapes, and even their shadows at certain times of day might correspond to remembered instructions. Walk 3 days toward the setting sun, then turn where the stones grow teeth. In parts of the Arabian desert, archaeologists found what looked like tiny stone libraries, clusters of rock lined in rows, each inscribed with basic geometric shapes. A triangle, a circle, a jagged line. To the modern eye, they're meaningless. But what if they were water formulas, agricultural calendars, astrological reminders? You trace your finger along one such groove, noting how it's been worn down, polished not by nature, but by human hands. This wasn't idle carving. Someone traced this line 1,000 times. A ritual, a memory exercise. Think of the inuksuk of the Arctic stone stacks used by Inuit peoples to convey everything from food nearby to danger ahead. Similar logic may have applied here. A leaning stack could signal a water catchment behind the dunes. A square of rocks with a central gap might mark a well. But there's more. Some stones were not carved but burned. Petroglyphs across the Sahara show evidence of fire treatment heat, used to etch symbols or mark stones with blackened faces. Some researchers believe this method preserved the marks against erosion better than simple chiseling. Others argue it gave the glyphs spiritual significance. And then there are the whispering stones, literally. In Mauritania and parts of ancient Persia, travelers described certain stones that sang when struck. The tone differed by shape and size. Arranged in a sequence, they created distinct notes. Could they have been used for signaling teaching ceremony? You'll never look at a dry plain the same way again. Some nomadic traditions include oral legends about talking stones, objects used by elders to teach the young without ever writing a word. Where the stone frowns turn south. Where the stones dance rest 3 nights. These metaphors may refer to actual formations whose positions or shadows served as cues. A curious site near the Libyan border features a spiral of basalt rocks, each carved with a variation of the same shape, a swirling line. Theories range from solar worship to navigation markers to astronomical timers. But what's fascinating is this. The carvings grow deeper toward the center. Was this meant to show passage of time? A countdown? A memorial? And here's a delicious mystery. In 2012, researchers found a desert basin in Oman where flat stones form precise hexagonal grids across the floor. No writing, no decoration. But every piece was hand-placed. Some believe it was an ancient coding system, perhaps for irrigation, perhaps for astronomy. Others dismiss it as meaningless. But honestly, that kind of effort usually means something. Let's also not forget many ancient languages were carved in stone. Proto-Arabic early Berber scripts and ancient Thamudic all appear as inscriptions across cliffs, canyons, and pillars. Some of these texts include not just names or dates, but warnings. One ominous line translates roughly to "He who drinks here in summer dies." Cool. But more often what you see aren't letters. They're symbols, universals. A sun with 3 rays, a crescent beside an eye, a figure with arms raised. You walk through a canyon, and every 5th rock seems to echo the same symbol, faint but deliberate. Modern researchers are beginning to suspect that these were more than decoration. They were part of a visual communication system used by people who couldn't carry scrolls or trust spoken words across tribes. Like emoji, but carved. Even the color of the stones mattered. Dark rocks absorbed heat and were easier to see from a distance. Light stones cooled quickly and often marked rest areas, or nighttime gathering spots. Now skeptics argue that we're overinterpreting, that these were just burial mounds or random rock piles. Maybe, but you feel it, don't you? That buzz in your chest when you spot a row of stones too neat to be nature's doing. The sense that someone left you a message, not in ink, not in sound, but in silence. A language that only reveals itself when the light is just right, and your imagination, no rivers, no lakes, no wells. And still they had water. Not a trickle, not a fluke. Enough to drink, to cook, to farm. The real miracle of the desert wasn't what they built. It was what they pulled from the sky. Let's start with the impossible. You wake before dawn. The desert is silent, colder than you'd expect, and just slightly wet. Wet. In this oven, but your fingers don't lie. There's a thin sheen of moisture on the tent cloth, and nearby, a series of nets strung between wooden posts glisten faintly. They're not catching animals. They're catching air. This is where ancient technology gets spooky. Because yes, people in the desert figured out how to harvest water from the atmosphere. And they did it centuries, sometimes millennia before modern air-to-water devices were even a concept. The idea is simple. The air, even in deserts, holds moisture, especially in the cool hours before sunrise. If you can get that air to condense on a surface, and if that surface slopes just right, the water runs down into a container. What sounds like magic is in fact physics. Take the air wells of the Middle East. These were cone-shaped stone structures designed to cool the air at night. Moisture would condense inside and trickle down into underground basins. They required no moving parts, no electricity, and very little maintenance. Some historians believe ancient versions existed in Mesopotamia, cruder perhaps, but based on the same principle. In the Andes and North Africa, people used fog nets, woven fabrics, stretched between poles on ridges, where coastal fog rolled inland. The wind pushed fog into the net, water condensed, and droplets ran into cisterns. Modern versions of this system are being revived right now to help remote villages survive climate change, but their roots are very, very old. And then there's the dew pit. Desert farmers in what is now Israel used shallow basins lined with polished stones. These pits radiated heat at night, cooling the stones to below air temperature. Moisture condensed on the stone and dripped into clay jars buried below. It wasn't fast, but it was consistent. Historians still argue whether these were purpose-built or cleverly reused quarry holes. Either way, someone figured out that sweating stones could save lives. One of the most impressive techniques, underground aqueducts known as qanats. Originating in ancient Persia, these systems carried water from underground sources, sometimes tens of kilometers away, to towns and fields. The genius lay in the gradient. The slope was just steep enough to let gravity do the work, but shallow enough to avoid erosion. Vertical shafts allowed maintenance and ventilation. Even the Romans borrowed this idea later on. You crawl into a surviving qanat, and the air temperature drops 10 degrees. The walls are damp. A slow trickle of water winds past your feet. This isn't plumbing. It's hydrology mixed with tunnel-building artistry. Desert people didn't just find water. They stored it with obsession. Massive cisterns, some carved directly into bedrock, collected every precious drop of rain. Roofs were designed to funnel water. Courtyards sloped inward, turning patios into collectors. In Petra, the Nabateans created a complex network of channels and dams to catch flash floods and guide them into underground chambers. some still functional today. In some North African villages, communal wells had stone markers indicating water levels across seasons. These weren't just helpful, they were survival ledgers. If water is below this line, plant nothing. If the line disappears, prepare for migration, and they shared it. Oases had intricate rules, sometimes enforced by oral law, sometimes by elders or engraved stone, that regulated who got how much water and when. Water was divided like time. You'd have irrigation rights for a particular hour or day, and you'd better not be late. Kind of like booking a slot at the gym, except if you missed it, your crops died. But not all water came from science. Some desert traditions speak of listening well spots where the ground made a faint hum if water flowed below. Skeptics scoff. Yet recent studies show that aquifers can produce subtle acoustic signals under certain geological conditions. Could generations of experience really have trained ears to hear what we now detect with sonar? You have to wonder. Even ancient rituals tied to water collection may have had practical roots. Ceremonies at sunrise on mountaintops, where the air is coolest and dew is thickest, songs sung during foggy mornings, timed to last exactly as long as it took to walk from net to jar. Were they spiritual or just brilliant time management disguised as worship? Some nomadic tribes used wool-lined baskets to gather dew. Others buried jars with narrow necks to minimize evaporation, their lids sealed with resin. These small tricks added up not to comfort, but to continuity. Enough water to make it to the next season. Enough water to raise a child. And don't think they wasted a drop. Gray water from cooking was reused for plants. Bathing was often done with a damp cloth, not a bucket. And any extra was shared, because hoarding water wasn't just selfish. In many desert laws, it was punishable by exile or worse. To steal water was to steal life. Today, environmental engineers study these old techniques, not for nostalgia, but for efficiency. Fog harvesting, passive condensation, underground flow, all are being explored for future cities, refugee camps, and off-grid housing. Grid. Some of the newest tech is just the old stuff with prettier packaging. And when you walk through the ruins and see the cracked basins, the worn cisterns, the clay pipes half buried in dust, it doesn't look broken. It looks like a blueprint. A whisper from the past saying, you already knew how to survive this. You just forgot. Next time, let's explore a technology not carved in stone, but carried by sound. What if you could send a message across the dunes without wires, lights, or even words? Not every message needs paper, or ink, or even a voice. What if instead of shouting across the sand, you could drum it, or hum it? What if the wind wasn't just howling? What if it was talking back? Let's put this idea to the test. It starts as always with a sound. You're walking through a narrow valley, half expecting silence. But then thud, 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 thud. It's rhythmic. Not wind, not animal. You pause. The sound repeats. Faint, measured, deliberate. It echoes differently than footsteps, and it's coming from far away. That's the idea behind what some call the silent drums of the desert. Across North Africa, Arabia, and parts of Central Asia, oral traditions tell of people who could send messages through vast stretches of open land using drums, pipes, and tuned stones. Sometimes through caves, sometimes using the ground itself. And while skeptics have dismissed many of these stories as folklore, modern acoustic studies are telling us something very different. In Mali, the talking drum, tam-tam, was once used not just for ritual, but for rapid communication between distant communities. A trained drummer could mimic tonal languages, saying full sentences through rhythm and pitch. In desert settings, where voices vanish in the open, these drums carried farther than shouting ever could. But it wasn't just drums. Some desert groups used ground drums. Hollow pits, covered with stretched hides, beat softly to send low-frequency pulses. These frequencies traveled through the earth and were felt more than heard, like a subwoofer buried under your feet. Some researchers believe these were early forms of coded warning systems. Think Morse code but earthbound. And then, of course, there's the sand itself. Certain dunes are famous for their booming. When conditions are just right, grain-sized dryness and slope sand cascades down the face of a dune and emits a loud, low-frequency hum. Some Bedouins claim they could recognize these sounds and interpret them, direction, intensity, even time of day. Sounds exaggerated? Possibly. But geophysicists have recorded booming dunes reaching 105 decibels. That's louder than city traffic. In regions like the Empty Quarter, tales persist of singing stones, not metaphorical ones, but real rocks that vibrated when struck. Some nomads carried sets of tuned stones with them, like primitive xylophones, using specific tones to announce arrival danger or request shelter. The echoes were the message. A short ring meant, "I'm here." A longer one meant, "I'm coming through." In the Iranian plateau, some caravanserais were spaced at sonic intervals, meaning a horn blown at one could be faintly heard at the next during still nights. That's not architectural coincidence. That's intentional planning based on how sound moves through open space. And then there were the windpipes. Some communities mounted reeds or clay flutes on rooftops or rocky outcrops. When the wind hit them just right, they'd whistle each pitch meaning something. A long, low moan might say, "Visitors coming." A high trill might warn of a dust storm. Some of these sound markers were passive, requiring no human to play them. They simply reacted to nature like weather vanes with voices. Historians still argue whether these instruments were truly communicative or merely atmospheric, but some written accounts from travelers describe locals interpreting flute tones as easily as a shepherd reads clouds. It's hard to say where music ends and message begins. Sound carried meaning in other ways, too. Footsteps on hard-packed ground echoed differently when someone was approaching with a heavy load or in a hurry. Experienced desert dwellers could tell who was coming long before seeing them simply by the rhythm of their gait. It sounds fantastical until you realize we all do this recognizing a friend's steps in a hallway. Now imagine training that sense across generations. Even silence had a role. A missing sound, no bird song, no insect hum, might signal danger water nearby or approaching strangers. Sound wasn't just used, it was read. One particularly fascinating technology came from the Berber tribes of the Maghreb. They used slit gongs, large wooden instruments with interior carvings that produced multiple tones depending on where they were struck. These gongs could mimic phrases and commands. Positioned strategically, they were heard kilometers away. And here's the twist. Many of these systems weren't written down. They were taught through apprenticeship. A child would learn not only to hear the message, but to feel it, the tempo, the texture, the space between beats. This wasn't just communication. It was culture. And when colonial forces arrived, many of these systems were outlawed or dismissed as tribal nonsense. Some were erased. Others fell into disuse when telegraphs and radios took over. But now, some communities are trying to bring them back, relearning how to drum a phrase, how to carve a reed whistle that sings in wind, how to listen for footsteps on dry earth. Acoustic archaeologists, yes, that's a real thing, are now exploring ancient amphitheaters and desert ruins, mapping how sound moves through forgotten corridors and valleys. They're finding that many coincidental sound effects were no accident. The walls were shaped to echo. The floors were angled to bounce noise. The past wanted to be heard. So next time the wind howls, or a dune groans, or you hear a distant beat with no source, don't ignore it. That might not be nature. That might be someone saying hello. Coming up next, from sound to symbols to pure abstraction, how the ancients measured their world with math, written not in numbers, but in shadows, ropes, and perfectly spaced palm trees. Palm trees planted in perfect lines, canals dug with uncanny symmetry, a shadow that falls just so at the same time every year. Did ancient desert people really have a handle on math, or is this just coincidence? Let's crunch some ancient numbers. You begin by following the shadow of a tower. Its long and deliberate stretching over a carefully paved courtyard. A small notch carved into the ground catches your eye just where the shadow ends. At noon tomorrow, it'll stop there again. Not because it has to, but because someone measured it that way centuries ago. Desert civilizations might seem like unlikely havens for geometry and algebra, but that's only if you assume math needs parchment and pens. In truth, it began with ropes, angles, water flow, and stars. Take the humble irrigation ditch. You follow one down into a field where the desert has briefly given way to greenery. The canals split at exact angles, 30 degrees, here 45 there, and feed individual plots arranged in neat rectangles. How not guesswork, not trial and error. It's all about ratios. Early farmers in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and North Africa used rope-stretching tools, sometimes marked with knots, to lay out grids. These ropes weren't crude. They were measuring devices. One common method used the famous 3-4-5 triangle, the simplest way to make a perfect right angle without a protractor. The Egyptians used it. So did the Nabateans. Some scholars believe it was passed along via trade routes. Others argue it was independently invented multiple times. Either way, the result was straight fields, aligned buildings, and efficient water flow. And the math didn't stop at farming. You enter a stone chamber deep within a desert ruin and find a series of shallow bowls etched into the floor. Each is a different size, but evenly spaced. A water clock, a mathematical model, maybe both. Historians still argue. What's certain is that the timekeeping wasn't based on counting seconds. It was based on observing nature's patterns and building tools to match them. One of the most sophisticated tools, the gnomon, a simple upright stick, used to measure time by its shadow. By tracking the shadow's length and angle throughout the day and year, ancient astronomers could determine solstices, equinoxes, and even estimate latitude. Some desert temples and tombs were aligned based on these measurements. In other words, the architecture itself was a calendar. And yes, they used that calendar for planting, for building, for traveling. You'd better believe they weren't guessing when to migrate herds or harvest dates. They used sundials, star charts, and horizon markers. The shadows told them everything. In Petra, several carved structures aligned perfectly with the rising sun during solstices. In Egypt, entire temple complexes acted as massive timepieces. In parts of Morocco and Algeria, stone circles, like the one at Missoura, may have served a similar function. Debate rages over their true purpose, but the alignment is suspiciously perfect. And then there's counting. Numbers weren't always written down, but they were spoken, taught, sung. Trade demanded it. You couldn't haggle over salt grain or livestock without a sense of quantity. Inscriptions from ancient Arabian markets suggest a system based on tens and twelves, likely influenced by finger joint counting or lunar cycles. Some desert groups even used pebbles or carved tokens as proto-ledger systems. One token, sure, one goat. Two tokens tied together, one camel. It's simplistic only if you don't need it to survive. For them, it was commerce insurance and record keeping all rolled into a pouch. Geometry also played a role in sacred spaces. Mosques and shrines often featured intricate tile work and layouts based on repeating geometric patterns. These weren't just for beauty. They reflected deep mathematical principles: symmetry, tessellation, fractals. Some tiles found in Persia and North Africa exhibit patterns that prefigure Penrose tiling a discovery only formalized in the 1970s. In other words, desert artisans stumbled onto advanced mathematics using nothing more than chisels and instinct. In fact, one theory suggests that by observing natural patterns, cracked mud dune waves, Honeycomb's desert mathematicians developed intuitive models of geometry that mirrored what later became formal theory. Imagine that. While European scholars were arguing about how many angels could dance on a pinhead, someone in a dusty tent was mapping the stars, building a sun calendar, and solving for X using palm shadows and goat bones. And math was not confined to men or elites. In some nomadic groups, women were the mathematicians of the household, measuring fabric, spacing tent poles, timing cooking rituals. Their expertise passed down orally, wrapped in daily practice. So next time you marvel at a perfect skyline or a sleek modern grid, remember your ancestors were already measuring the world with ropes, stars, and songs. And just as they calculated space, they calculated health. Coming up, how desert medicine cabinets were stocked not with pills, but with plants' dust and centuries of surprisingly effective wisdom. You're parched, sunburned, and nursing a nasty cut from a thorny bush. There's no pharmacy, no clinic, just sand and shrubs. But then someone hands you a leaf, a paste, a powder, and suddenly the pain fades. Could the desert itself have been one vast sun-baked apothecary? Let's open the medicine chest. The idea that ancient desert dwellers practiced sophisticated medicine might seem unlikely. After all, we imagine sterile white coats, microscopes, and synthetic drugs. But before all that, there were roots, resins, and rituals, and they worked far more often than you might think. We start with myrrh. Sticky, fragrant reddish brown. You've heard of it as a biblical gift, but it was more than a sacred scent. Desert cultures used it as an antiseptic analgesic and even an embalming agent. Rubbed into wounds, it reduced infection. Boiled into tea, it soothed stomach pain. Modern studies confirm it has antibacterial and anti-inflammatory properties. Not bad for tree sap. Next, henna. Yes, it stains the skin in elaborate patterns, but it also cools the body and repels insects. Some communities used henna pastes on the soles of the feet to prevent heat stroke. Others wrapped feverish children in cloths soaked with henna water to draw out the heat. Then there's frankincense, another aromatic resin burned to calm the mind and purify the air. But it wasn't just spiritual. Frankincense smoke had antiseptic qualities. Some Bedouin tribes used it to treat respiratory infections. A few even inhaled it during childbirth to reduce pain and fear. Historians still argue whether its effects were pharmacological or placebo, but results are results. Desert people also understood digestion out of sheer necessity. Spices like cumin, coriander, and fennel weren't just for flavor. They prevented bloating, warded off parasites, and help preserve food. You eat a gritty stew, laced with these herbs, and feel your stomach settle. That's ancient chemistry at work. One curious practice comes from Saharan tribes who treated dehydration before it happened. How by preparing a special drink, fermented goat milk with a pinch of salt and powdered root bark. The result? A probiotic electrolyte replenishing tonic. Think of it as Gatorade's nomadic ancestor. Desert wounds weren't treated with band-aids. Instead, spider webs were pressed into gashes to clot blood. Ants' jaws were used as stitches. And ash from burned plants served as both cauterizing agent and disinfectant. You see a cut treated with crushed charcoal and think it's primitive until it heals faster than your store-bought ointment. Plants were classified not just by appearance but by behavior. A plant that sweated in heat was believed to reduce fever. One that grew near snake holes, likely to treat venom. This wasn't random. It was observation passed through generations. Herbalists memorized hundreds of desert species, each with its season part to harvest and method of preparation. One such healer might carry a leather pouch filled with powdered bark-dried leaves and mineral clays. Nothing labeled, no instructions. Yet each item served a purpose. Blue clay for skin irritation, crushed date pits for diarrhea, smoke from desert thyme to treat melancholy. Yes, melancholy. Mental health wasn't ignored. Music scent and communal storytelling were used to soothe anxiety and insomnia. A warm compress with lavender and myrtle leaves helped induce sleep. Some cultures even prescribed desert walks, ritual treks, through sacred paths to reset the mind. A spiritual journey, yes, but also a psychological cleanse. What about surgery limited but not absent? Dental tools made of obsidian or bronze have been found in desert ruins. They weren't performing heart transplants, but they were draining abscesses, removing rotten teeth, and setting broken bones. Splints made of date palm wood. Bandages soaked in aloe. Even childbirth was ritualized into medical routine. Midwives used scented oils to reduce pain, encouraged specific squatting postures to ease delivery, and administered tonics made of ground herbs and camel's milk to stimulate contractions. And after birth, honey and salt rubbed onto the baby's lips part, blessing, part antiseptic. A recurring ingredient, camel urine. Yes, you read that right. Used for everything from acne to scalp conditions. Modern tests suggest antimicrobial properties. Is it a miracle cure? Probably not. But again, results speak. They even use sand. Heated and wrapped in cloth, it served as a pain-relieving compress. Mixed with oil, it formed exfoliating pastes. And in rare cases, certain colored sands were thought to hold healing energies. The science is murky, but the tradition persisted. And they adapted. New plants brought by traders like cinnamon turmeric or nutmeg were quickly folded into existing treatments. Recipes evolved. Techniques improved. Trade wasn't just goods, it was ideas. A North African remedy might borrow ingredients from India via Arabia, refined with Egyptian technique. And guess what? Some of those recipes are still around. In Tunisia and Morocco, traditional healers still use ancient blends to treat colds and joint pain. In parts of Jordan, Bedouin families pass down poultices made of olive oil and desert herbs. In Mauritania, you can find herbalists whose ingredient lists match texts from 800 years ago. So don't be so quick to laugh at that dusty bundle of leaves, because the real difference between old medicine and new packaging. Coming next, from the dusty tools of medicine to the breezy secrets of survival, how desert dwellers built tents that breathe. A tent that cools you in the heat, keeps bugs out, lets air in, packs up in minutes, and was invented thousands of years ago. It's not science fiction, it's ancient desert design. So, how exactly do you weave comfort? Let's step inside one of history's smartest inventions. You duck beneath a flap of fabric and immediately feel it, a drop in temperature, a subtle change in air pressure, and an unmistakable calm. Outside, the sun roasts everything it touches. Inside, you're shaded breathing, easily surrounded by woven panels that whisper in the wind. This isn't just a tent, it's technology. Nomadic desert peoples, like the Bedouin Tuareg and Berber, have spent thousands of years perfecting portable homes. The genius, they didn't try to fight the desert. They designed with it. Start with the fabric. These tents are woven from goat hair and camel wool, spun and dyed by hand. The fibers are thick, dark, and oily, not a fashion choice, but a functional one. Goat hair swells slightly when wet, making the weave tighten during rare rainstorms. That means waterproofing without tarps. On dry days, the weave relaxes, letting air flow freely. One material, two climate responses. The dark color might seem counterintuitive. Wouldn't black absorb heat? Yes, but in this case, that's the point. The upper layers of the tent heat quickly and cause hot air to rise and escape, pulling cooler air in from the sides. It's a passive ventilation system, powered by nothing but physics and patience. And it's not just about the weave, it's about the layout. Tents are pitched with the prevailing wind in mind. Openings face away from gusts. Panels can be raised or lowered like blinds. Some designs include inner chambers or wind tunnels that direct breeze towards sleeping areas while keeping sand out. You shift a flap, and suddenly the tent breathes deeper. Historians still debate who first mastered this method. The designs vary by region, but the logic is universal adaptability, not rigidity. You don't build a fortress in the sand, you wear it. The tent isn't just shelter, it's status, it's identity. A well-crafted tent announces the tribe, the family, the craftsmanship of the women who wove it, because yes, it was mostly women. The weavers understood texture pattern and thermal response long before engineers gave it names. Some tents included decorative bands, red and indigo stripes that weren't just pretty. They signaled marriage status, clan affiliations, and even carried protective motifs believed to repel bad spirits or just mosquitoes. Speaking of which, how do you keep bugs out in the middle of nowhere? With design. The lower edges of the tent were often dug slightly into the sand, forming a natural moat. Fabric fringes moved constantly in the wind, confusing insects. In some regions, herbal smoke was channeled through openings at night to keep pests away, and the interior carefully arranged. Raised platforms of woven mats, or hides, allowed airflow from beneath and discouraged creepy crawlers. Then there's the anchor system. These tents aren't staked down with mass-produced aluminum pins. They use carved wooden pegs and ropes made from plant fibers or braided wool. Flexible, strong, and easily replaceable. The entire structure can be packed in under 30 minutes and rebuilt before the next sunset. And yes, they last. Some goat hair panels are passed down across generations. Others are rewoven, continuously repaired at the loom with no waste. When a section frays beyond use, it becomes a mat, a saddle pad, or insulation for water jars. Nothing is wasted. Everything is part of the system. But don't imagine endless brown monotony. These tents were beautiful. Interior panels featured embroidery, beadwork, even dyed feathers. Wall dividers were hung to create private spaces. Lantern niches, storage slings, and ceremonial cushions turned a shelter into a home. When guests arrived, the best panel, often the one with the family crest or tribal pattern, was displayed at the front like a flag. Some tents were colossal. A tribal leader's tent might house 30 people with multiple rooms, cooking areas, and storage zones. Others were humble just enough for sleep and shade. But all followed the same logic: breathable boundaries, modular structure, climate consciousness. Archaeologists studying tent remains in Jordan and Iran have found charred patches of wool embedded in soil, still showing signs of dye and wear. These fragments, though fragile, confirm what oral histories have said for centuries: desert tents weren't temporary shacks. They were engineered systems of survival. Even the spacing of tents mattered. Camps were laid out to block windshare shade and reduce fire risk. Social hierarchy influenced layout. Elders near the center, new couples farther out. Paths were formed, naturally creating breathable alleys between shelters. It was urban planning without pavement. And all of this was portable. Try folding your house into a few rolls of cloth and 2 bags of poles. You sit inside one of these woven wonders and suddenly realize this is better than a plastic tent from a camping store. It breathes. It lives. It thinks. The materials know what to do. The design doesn't resist nature. It collaborates with it. No zippers. No synthetic nylon. No tangled poles. Just tradition, tension, and wind. Next time you admire a fancy glamping setup, remember nomads already did it better. And speaking of gathering under tents, what happens when dozens, hundreds, even thousands of desert dwellers come together not to survive but to share next? How desert marketplaces became the world's most unlikely laboratories of innovation. Silks from the east, spices from the south, maps from strangers, news from everywhere. The market was never just about trade, it was about transmission. But if no one wrote anything down, how did innovation move through the sands? Let's walk through the aisles of ancient ingenuity. You step into the chaos. It's loud. It's bright. It smells like cardamom, sweat wool, and roasted meat. The desert market is not a dusty, quiet stall. It's a festival of sound, color, and ideas. Traders from 5 languages yell over each other. Camels snort. Musicians drum. Children weave through legs. And beneath it all, there's a hum, a buzz of transactions. You can't see knowledge changing hands. The desert was never truly isolated. These marketplaces, scattered from Marrakesh to Mecca, Timbuktu to Tabriz, were epicenters of experimentation. And the goods, they were just the packaging. Take tools. You find a vendor selling curved knives, unlike anything you've seen. Turns out the curve isn't decorative, it's for skinning camels more efficiently. The shape was perfected over generations and copied across tribes. That design, it will later inspire surgical blades in medieval Spain, and no one wrote a patent. Further down, someone's trading water wheels, not full machines models. Clay miniatures that show how to angle paddles, weight buckets, balance flow. Another stall sells dyes that change color. With temperature, a textile trick that's half fashion, half chemistry. And over there, a man is spinning thread from cactus fiber, boasting that it doesn't mold like cotton. You sit for mint tea in a shaded corner and overhear a debate, 2 traders arguing about camel saddle design. One says, higher arches reduce injury. The other insists that split wood frames carry more weight. Neither writes this down, but they sketch and sand gesture wildly and swap samples. And just like that, a new design begins to spread. This is what innovation looked like. word of mouth, gesture, demonstration. Some historians call it embodied knowledge skills, passed hand to hand, eye to eye, not via scrolls, but through doing. And the marketplace was where it flourished. It wasn't just goods, it was conversations. A Syrian doctor might learn a Sudanese poultice for scorpion bites. A Tuareg blacksmith might trade forging tips with a Persian armor maker. A woman selling fermented milk might mention a clay jar that keeps it cool for 3 days longer. That tidbit worth more than gold. Historians still argue about how much actual technology came from these exchanges versus parallel invention. But archaeological layers tell a story similar. Tools, textiles, and techniques appear along trade routes in suspiciously synchronized timelines. The market was a classroom without desks. Children watched their parents haggle and repair. Apprentices sat behind stalls copying gestures. Some markets even had informal demo zones, public spaces, where inventors showed off contraptions, or craftsmen displayed new techniques. Want to see the sharpest blade? Head to the tannery tent at noon. Want to try the fastest spinning wheel? Look for the woman with red beads on her braids. And it wasn't limited to men. Women were key players in these markets, especially in medicinal goods, textiles, food innovations, and household tools. Many ran stalls, negotiated contracts, and trained the next generation. In parts of West Africa, entire sections of the market were matriarchal, governed, organized, and protected by female trade guilds. Ideas didn't just stay put. Caravan leaders, always chasing profit, carried them onward. A new fabric dye, discovered in Kairouan. 6 months later, it's in a bazaar in Bukhara. A clever grain storage pot, shaped like a conch shell, now being copied in 3 languages. Even architectural concepts moved this way. A merchant's awning system that used split palm ribs to create collapsible shade, eventually copied for use in tent design and even palace courtyards. No drawing boards, just observation and memory. Let's not forget that markets also spread words. Travelers shared folk tales, religious texts, riddles, and recipes. Some of those stories contained embedded engineering: the well that never dries the net, that drinks fog, the house that cools itself. These weren't just metaphors. They were mnemonic devices, carrying tech wisdom disguised as entertainment. Some innovations traveled so far, they lost their origin entirely. Who invented the double-chamber clay water jar? We may never know. But you'll find it from Oman to Morocco, unchanged for centuries past through thousands of hands, each one adjusting the curve just a little. And sometimes the biggest innovations came from mistakes. A spilled dye that colored fabric permanently. A warped pot that kept food cool. A cracked flute that made an eerie sound and was then turned into a communication tool. These happy accidents were shared in laughter stories and copycat production. The market made room for error and turned it into evolution. Some marketplaces even had ethics. Elders enforced rules about price fairness, measurement standards, and product quality. Cheating wasn't just bad business, it was sacrilege. The scale wasn't just weighed, it was blessed. In some regions, traders swore oaths before setting up shop, and a bad reputation could exile you permanently. But within those rules, endless creativity. You touch a sandal with a zigzag sole. The vendor says it copies the feet of goats, perfect for sand grip. A cooking pot with a spiral base. It reduces burning. A ladle with a curved edge scrapes the bottom better. These aren't gadgets. They're generations of micro-innovation compressed into objects that look deceptively simple. Modern anthropologists study these marketplaces with awe, not because of what was sold, but how it moved, adapted, merged. It's innovation without whiteboards, research without labs. And yet, like all things, the markets weren't permanent. Some were wiped out by conquest, others by colonization. Others faded when roads turned to highways and global shipping killed the need for conversation. But their legacy, still here. In the tools we use, the food we eat, the words we speak. Next, if the marketplace was a lab, then the schools were something even stranger, secret, silent, and sometimes lost entirely. Some schools had no buildings, some scrolls had no ink, and some teachers, they never spoke above a whisper. What kind of education system survives in the shadows, leaves no graduation robes, and still changes the course of civilization? Let's sneak into the lost classrooms of the desert. It begins with a strange room, not a school by modern standards, just a mud brick chamber behind a market, its floor covered in smoothed sand. But on the walls, there are markings, symbols scratched into the clay, faint grooves worn from repetition. In the corner, bundles of date palm bark, bundled scrolls, bits of dried herbs, broken measuring sticks. You've stepped into one of the forgotten schools of the ancient desert world. These weren't massive universities. They weren't even always called schools, but they were places of instruction, quietly powerful hubs, where knowledge passed from hand to hand, voice to ear symbol, to muscle memory. Take the agricultural rooms of the Sahel. They look like storage huts, but buried beneath the floor. Archaeologists have found carved diagrams of irrigation routes, tiny networks etched into stone slabs along with pebbles, likely used to simulate water flow. Children would move the pebbles through these mazes to learn how to design efficient canals. Think of it as Minecraft for farmers, or consider the modular schools of the Bedouin. Under a tent roof, children learned from elders through recitation song and model making. Ropes were used to teach geometry. Bones arranged in circles explained lunar calendars. The stars themselves were textbooks pointed at named tracked nightly. Historians still argue whether these informal systems should be called education, but they followed rules levels of mastery memorization, stages, rites of passage. Some even had oral exams. A 10-year-old might be tested on wind direction, animal tracks, and starlight reading before being considered an adult navigator. And then there were the code scrolls. Rare, fragile, often written on bark leather, or even thin sheets of stone. These scrolls didn't always contain writing. Instead, diagrams, geometric grids, moon cycles, seasonal markers. One scroll found near an oasis in modern-day Algeria contains a visual calendar marked by palm tree silhouettes, each representing a harvest stage water depth and sun angle. The literacy rate in these regions might not have been high in the alphabet sense, but in symbol fluency, remarkable. Entire villages knew how to read architectural diagrams sketched in ash. Recipes were remembered as gestures. Construction techniques were passed on using wooden models with notches and grooves. A child would assemble a miniature grain silo before they ever touched a full-size wall. The city of Timbuktu, now associated with remoteness, was once a beacon of scholarship. Its sand-colored libraries housed over 700,000 manuscripts, many still being uncovered today. Subjects ranged from astronomy to medicine, trade law to poetry. But the real secret: these libraries weren't static. They were part of a learning web. Traveling scholars carried condensed versions of texts, memory rhymes, code, diagrams, symbol charts across trade routes. teaching in bursts before moving on. This created a distributed education system, decentralized, adaptive, and resilient. If one teacher vanished, 5 students could take their place. Many of these schools had no desks. Students sat on mats, carved lessons into dust with sticks, then erased and started again. Practice wasn't documented, it was embodied. One wrong answer. Try again. No shame. No grade. Just sand sweat, and eventually, skill. And what did they study? Not abstract philosophy. Not history as chronology, but tools for survival, water measurement, herbal combinations, star-based scheduling, structural angles. And all of it was cross-disciplinary. Learning irrigation meant learning soil chemistry. Studying stars meant understanding timekeeping. It was all woven together. Even storytelling was educational. Fables carried embedded math. If the fox shares his figs among 5 friends, how many remain? Proverbs hid laws of physics. A tent that doesn't breathe collapses at dusk. Children didn't just laugh, they learned. And these schools weren't always open to outsiders. Some traditions guarded knowledge fiercely, especially regarding medicinal recipes, map songs, and construction tricks. Access was granted only after years of loyalty. Knowledge was precious because it meant survival. In one Berber community, it's said that only after a boy survives a desert crossing without assistance is he shown the wind maps, diagrams scratched into hide that predict sandstorms based on bird flight and insect patterns. Other schools, like the secret herbal archives of southern Arabia, were passed matrilineally grandmothers to daughters to granddaughters. Many of these lineages broke only recently disrupted by war, colonization, or migration. Modern anthropologists are now racing to record what remains. Elders are interviewed, diagrams photographed, but some knowledge resists capture. It was never meant to be pinned down. It lives in rhythm, repetition, ritual. It's not lost. It's dormant. And that makes you wonder, if we judge these systems not by paper, but by impact, would we see them as primitive or as some of the most efficient adaptive learning models ever invented? And here's the twist. Some of the inventions we're rediscovering in modern green tech architecture and wellness. They're pulled straight from those very scrolls, diagrams, and sand drawings. Which begs the question, are we inventing the future or remembering the past? Next, we finally face the uncomfortable truth when it comes to technology. Maybe the ancients weren't behind us, but ahead. They didn't have plastic, or microchips, or carbon fiber. But they cooled homes without power, found water without pumps, and traveled without GPS. Are we truly more advanced or just louder? Let's ask a quietly uncomfortable question. You're sitting beneath a solar panel, sipping filtered water, checking a satellite map on your phone. All of this took thousands of engineers, billions of dollars, and a global supply chain. And yet, somewhere out there, a desert shepherd just tied a strip of goat leather into a knot and created a weather barometer. Are we really the clever ones? There's a growing realization among architects, designers, and sustainability experts that many so-called modern solutions have deep roots in ancient technologies, especially those born from harsh environments like deserts. The logic is simple. If it works without fossil fuels, wires, or constant updates, it's probably genius. Let's revisit some basics. Modern buildings struggle to stay cool in heat waves. But millennia ago, people built thick mud walls, high ceilings, and wind catchers that funneled breeze with surgical precision. Their structures didn't resist heat, they orchestrated it. Today's tech races to collect water from the air. But in ancient Morocco, Fog nets woven from palm fibers did the job without electricity. Entire villages survived on dew. And while we marvel at Google Earth, don't forget desert travelers use star paths, singing dunes, and animal behavior to navigate flawlessly. No batteries required. Historians still debate whether these parallels are coincidence or continuity. Did we reinvent what they already knew? Or did we simply forget it in our rush to digitize the world? Either way, the pattern is clear. Our version of progress often involves rediscovering the wheel, only this time we call it a disruptive innovation and give it a glossy logo. Let's look at air conditioning, one of the largest energy sinks in modern cities. Yet in the ancient city of Yazd, homes stayed cool using passive airflow, thick walls, and strategic shading. A full neighborhood was designed to breathe not from vents, but from geometry. Or consider water systems. Desalination plants cost millions and consume massive power, but ancient Persians used Qanat's gravity-fed tunnels to bring underground water to the surface across miles. No pumps, no pressure tanks, just math and endurance. Even modern eco-architecture borrows from ancient styles domes for thermal efficiency, courtyards, for air circulation, light wells for natural illumination. The word bioclimatic design is just a fancier name for what people in mud huts did instinctively. Now let's talk data. Today we rely on sensors and spreadsheets to model climate water usage migration. But ancient societies used oral history, seasonal rituals, and behavioral observation to forecast droughts, harvests, and disease outbreaks. In some ways, their data was richer because it included not just numbers, but meaning. One powerful example, the Tuareg wind calendar. Passed down through poetry and gesture, it mapped seasonal wind shifts across the Sahara. Traders timed journeys, farmers planted crops, and communities held festivals based on its invisible cues. Compare that to modern forecasting apps, which still struggle to predict weather a week out. So why did we forget colonization played a role? Many indigenous systems were dismissed as unscientific. Oral knowledge wasn't considered real. Clay and thatch were replaced by concrete and glass, not because they were better, but because they looked modern. Then came industrialization. Speed replaced wisdom. Replication replaced adaptation. We built cities for machines, not for humans. Air conditioners became necessary because the buildings themselves stopped working with nature. And here's the irony. As climate change accelerates, we're rediscovering that primitive solutions are often the only viable ones. Architects now study Bedouin tent logic. Engineers copy termite mounds for airflow design. Health experts examine herbal dust wraps for wound healing. You laugh at a goatskin water pouch until you realize it keeps water cooler longer without plastic. You dismiss a wall painted with crushed lime and ash until you see it repel heat mold and bugs better than anything from Home Depot. This isn't nostalgia, it's a recalibration. What we call high-tech is just overcomplicated low-tech. And it forces us to confront a question that's bigger than blueprints and gadgets. What if advancement isn't about doing more? What if it's about needing less? That quiet village that survives on dew, wind, and shadow. It isn't behind us. It's ahead. It figured out sustainability without writing a single policy paper. So maybe it's time to stop asking how advanced we are and start asking how much we've forgotten. Coming up in our final stretch, we return to the sand, to the voices buried there, and listen one last time to what they've been trying to teach us all along. You've heard the winds walk the ruins, trace the shadows, But here's the last question. What if the future we're designing is already behind us, and the answers we need were whispered by the sand all along? Let's listen closely this time. You're standing at the edge of a dune just before dawn. The stars fade one by one. A breeze stirs. You've been here before, but something feels different. Maybe it's the weight of everything you've learned. Or maybe it's the quiet. You realize this place has never been silent. You just weren't listening. The desert was never empty. It was encrypted. Everything you thought was primitive turned out to be precise. Every forgotten practice, a piece of a system more refined than you imagined. From sun-cooled homes to acoustic messaging, from fog-harvesting fabrics to memory-encoded stone stacks, this wasn't survival. It was strategy. It's not romanticizing the past. It's recognizing patterns. You step through a ruin and feel it, a flow of air that shouldn't be there. A shadow that moves too predictably. A pit shaped like a question mark. Everything in the desert had a reason, even if it wore the disguise of coincidence. The people who lived here didn't just adapt to harsh conditions. They shaped them. They harnessed time, space, temperature, sound. And they did it without ever naming it technology. Because when a way of life is embedded with wisdom, you don't need to name it. You just live it. Historians still argue over how much knowledge was lost and how much was absorbed into other cultures without credit. But some things can't be erased. The shape of a wall, the curve of a roof, the way a goat's foot taught someone how to make better sandals. Knowledge doesn't always travel in books. Sometimes it lingers in footsteps. You trace a spiral path down a dune, just as countless others did before you. You don't know why the path curves, but it's smoother, easier. It's been walked that way for a reason. That's inheritance. That's design passed invisibly between generations. And now we are coming back around. Architects borrow desert wisdom for green buildings. Engineers study traditional air wells. Urban planners look to wind-maze cities for cooler, cleaner design. We aren't innovating, we're recovering. And there's beauty in that. To be humbled by the past is not defeat, it's direction. If we can learn to look again, to listen again, to trace not just what was built, but why it was built that way, we might just find what we've been missing. The desert doesn't care about your algorithms. It doesn't crash. It doesn't go offline. It simply teaches the same lesson again and again. Use what you have. Move with the wind. Listen more than you speak. Respect the invisible. And maybe stop mistaking quiet for empty. Because the silence of the desert isn't silence. It's memory. It's warning. It's invitation. And somewhere in the shade of a stone arch or the hum of a dry dune, the past is still speaking, if only to remind us that technology doesn't begin with the future. It begins with understanding. Now dim the lights even further. Let your breath slow. Let the warmth of these old ideas wrap around you like a blanket stitched from sand and starlight. You are safe here. The night is long, and the past is still whispering. Let the last grains of desert wind settle. You've wandered through ancient homes that breathed without machines and met engineers who never used the word engineer. You've watched the stars map your steps, heard whispers ride through stone, and seen water drip from air as if the sky itself offered its blessing. And now, let your shoulders relax. Let your thoughts soften. Imagine the smell of sun-warmed clay, the feel of goat hair fabric brushing your arm, the weight of a ceramic cup filled with cool, sweet water. In the distance, someone hums an old lullaby. Maybe it's for you. Maybe it always was. This isn't just history. It's memory yours, somehow deep in your bones. A reminder that humans have always been clever, always curious, always trying to make life a little softer, a little cooler, a little more beautiful. The sand shifts the stars' wheel slowly overhead, and somewhere in your chest, a question curls into a smile. What else have we forgotten that's waiting to be remembered? But for now, it's time to rest. Let the wind carry your thoughts away. Let the hum of old inventions sing you to sleep. And when the morning comes, maybe, just maybe, you'll wake up with a new way of seeing. And if this journey stirred something in you, curiosity, wonder, maybe even a forgotten memory, consider sharing this video. Drop a comment below about what surprised you most, and don't forget to subscribe. There's so much more waiting to be uncovered.